Chapter 478. When the talisman power rose from the lakeside, Yisu stood in the wind and snow on the city wall and said, "Uncle Yensei really knows people well. Who would have thought that Ninkei could have such skills in just a few days after he started talisman Taoism?" In his opinion, the talismans written by Ninkei were not very powerful, and some of them were even obvious beginner's skills. In the eyes of ordinary people, they would be amused. However, the fact that Ninkei had written so many talismans in less than 2 years really shocked him. What shocked Yisu most was Ninkei's method of using talismans. The talisman sea storm by the lakeside seemed to be chaotic, but in fact, it had its own rules. The cooperation between each talisman was perfect. Otherwise, it would be impossible to create such momentum and effect. Eldest brother explained with a smile, "Youngest brother is a great calligrapher. He is good at writing. He has profound attainments in how to break down and write characters." Yisu slightly frowned and said, "I still can't understand how he could write so many talismans." Talisman master paid attention to talent. Whether he was the successor of Jisho Abbey or the sage of sword Liu Bai, it was difficult for him to get close to talisman Taoism in his life. But it did not mean that he had no understanding of talisman Taoism. Any talisman master could only use the talismans he wrote. Even if a divine talisman master like Master Yensei could leave several divine talismans for his disciples, the number would not be too much. Talisman master needed a lot of psyche power and painstaking efforts to write talismans. It also needed a lot of materials. Ninkei had only been making talismans for 2 years. How could he write so many talismans? The academy has nothing but a lot of cultivation materials. If there is any shortage, the imperial court will help to prepare it. As for the psyche power needed to write talismans, eldest brother smiled and said, "Mr. Yisu probably doesn't know that youngest brother's psyche power can be ranked in the front in the back of the mountain of the academy." The disciples in the back of the mountain of the academy were not famous in the world. However, Yisu was very clear that those people must have their own talents. At this time, when he heard that Ninkei's psyche power could be ranked in the front in the back of the mountain of the academy, he could not help but feel a little surprised. At this moment, Jing Fu appeared over the lakeside house. Yisu felt the straight and piercingly cold talisman intent coming from that direction. His eyebrows slowly raised and he looked in the direction of Yanming Lake for a long time. Then his eyebrows gradually relaxed and he said, "Half-divine talisman is not a divine talisman after all." The eldest brother looked at the lake in the night and said with a little regret, "Although the youngest brother has made great progress, he hasn't been practicing talisman Taoism for long, so he hasn't become a divine talisman master yet." Yisu shook his head and said, "Divine talisman master, so what? Unless you reach the level of martial Uncle Yensei, if you want to defeat someone like Xiaoho with just a light talisman paper, it can only be wishful thinking. I've never thought that I could kill Xiaoho with talisman Taoism. My master probably had such an ability in his heyday, but I didn't. Naturally, I have my own ideas." Ninkei looked at the other side of the river, which was once again swallowed by the darkness of the night, and said, "Everyone says that one can't challenge someone of a higher state. No one in the world, including the senior brothers of the academy, believes that I can defeat Xiaoho. But I insist on doing it because they have all miscalculated one thing. I have never thought of defeating Xiaoho. I only want to kill him. If you don't defeat the enemy, how can you kill the enemy? A battle is only a moment, but killing a person can be a very long process. There can be many battles in it. In the countless battles before, I may not be able to defeat him, but I can make him bleed. Then, even if I still can't defeat him in the end, his blood may be drained. When his blood is drained, he will naturally die. Tonight, Xiaoho and I are not competing with strength, psyche power, or state, but to see who can drain his blood faster. He is a powerhouse of the devil's doctrine, and his defense is too terrifying. He is like a turtle. What I have to do is to constantly bleed this turtle, and make sure that I won't be bitten to death by him." Ninkei said solemnly, "Thank you, Tang. I have broken the outermost layer of the turtle shell on Xiaoho's body. Then what I have to do next is relatively simple." Sang Sang looked at him and said, "We will succeed." Ninkei said a lot today and explained a lot. If it was not Sang Sang beside him, but another audience such as Yi Hongyu, Yi Hongyu would have been extremely annoyed and would have kicked him into the ice lake under the cliff. Sang Sang was a little surprised at first, but then she understood the reason. Ning Ke did not have the slightest confidence in facing Xia Ho, even if his expression was so calm, and his tone was so peaceful, as if he was full of confidence and everything was under control, even if he had prepared for a whole 15 years. He still did not have confidence. So he kept talking about his preparation and the reason why he would definitely win, to make himself believe that he could really succeed in the cross-state challenge and defeat the seemingly invincible and powerful enemy. Sang Sang was very worried about Ning Ke's current mental state. So she kept using a more certain tone than Ning Ke, saying, "We will definitely win." When the whole world did not believe in Ning Ke, and even when Ning Ke himself was about to lose confidence, then she was the only one left who could give him the last bit of confidence. Because this was not only Ning Ke's battle, but also the battle between the two of them. Sang Sang put the big black umbrella on her thin shoulder, and stretched out her right hand to tightly grasp Ning Ke's clothes. She gripped it so hard that her callous fingers seemed to sink into his body. Then she slowly closed her eyes without batting her eyelashes. Xia Ho walked out of the lakeside courtyard and came to the lake embankment. In front of him were several willows. The berserk sea of talisman papers attacked his powerful body thousands of times. Although it didn't leave any wounds on his body, it cut his hair bun. His black hair was mixed with several stalks of silver, and it draped over his back, making him look like a demon god in a Buddhist painting. However, his tattered clothes and the broken armor tied around his waist made this demon god look very wretched. Xia Ho reached out and tore off the pieces of armor on his waist, like throwing garbage under the willow tree. Then he looked at the night sky around Yanming Lake and coughed. In the cold winter night, the temperature was so low that the lake ice was as hard as steel. But it should not make a powerhouse at the peak state of martial arts who was as hard as steel feel it. Xia Ho was surprised that there were so many talismans in the lakeside courtyard that even the wind and snow could not bear it. He was surprised that Ning Ke's ability in talisman Taoism was much stronger than the rumors. What surprised him most was that Ning Ke could use talismans from such a distance. The accident made people vigilant. He knew that he had made a mistake, but since he knew what was wrong, he could correct it. Therefore, he did not care and still looked around the winter lake in silence. The shore of Yanming Lake was covered in white snow. However, the night was too dark. There were no stars or lights. Therefore, the bright sky and the earth were dim and the snow seemed to have turned black. The night shrouded the nearby willows and the distant reeds. Whether it was the frozen lake water or the hills around the lake, they were all dark. No matter how sensitive one's perception was, one could not see anything with the naked eye. Xia Ho did not know where Ning Ke was at this time. He only knew that he must be on the shore of Yanming Lake, but he did not know whether it was the wooden bridge on the west bank, the snow forest on the east bank or the cliff on the south bank. But he was sure that if Ning Ke moved again, he would die. Ning Ke stood on the cliff, holding an iron bow in his hand. He raised the iron bow and slowly pulled the bowstring. The bowstring hummed slightly and was instantly covered by the wind and snow. There was some snow on the black iron bow, making it look colder. The iron arrow engraved with complicated talisman lines on the bowstring was aimed at the night sky on the north bank of Yanming Lake. The night clouds covered the stars, and it was dark everywhere. There were no stars and no figure. Xia Ho could not see him, and Ning Ke naturally could not see Xia Ho. This time was different from last year when he shot Prince Longqing on the snow cliff in the wilderness. At that time, Prince Longqing was at the critical moment of breaking the realm. His cultivation state was full of vigor, as if he was burning his natal life. In Ning Ke's sense of perception, he was like a golden flower that was about to bloom. Even if he was more than 10 miles away, he clearly did not need to aim. Xia Ho, as a powerhouse at the peak state of martial arts, could merge with the willows by the lake. Even if Ning Ke entered the knowing destiny state, he could not locate Xia Ho. In this case, where was he going to shoot the primordial 13 arrows in his hand? At this moment, Sang Sang, who was under the big black umbrella, closed her eyes and frowned her thin eyebrows. She set 2 numbers, 633, 21772. More than 2 years ago, deep in the Min Mountain in spring, an arrow came from the northern mountain road. At that time the forest was burning. When the third assassin attacked Ning Kai, Sang Sang hid under the big black umbrella, closed her eyes and shouted 2 words with all her strength. More than 2 years later, by the cliff of the ice lake in the cold winter, under the willows on the north bank, a strong enemy stood silently. At this time wind and snow were dancing on the cliff, and Sang Sang shouted 2 numbers again. These numbers were coordinates that only Ning Kai and Sang Sang understood. In the past 15 years, they accompanied them to hunt in the Min Mountain. Fighting with their lives on the line had become instinctive and would not make mistakes. It was almost the same as 2 years ago, but the numbers shouted by Sang Sang tonight were much more complicated. The complexity of the number often represented the degree of accuracy. The cold and dark arrow moved slowly, looking for a target in the night snow. Then it stopped. He released the taut bowstring. The iron arrow left the bowstring and disappeared in the turbulent hole in front of the bow, and disappeared in the wind and snow. Xiahou firmly believed that as long as Ning Kai attacked again, he would die. Ning Kai used the most powerful primordial 13 arrows. The dark iron arrow disappeared in front of the cliff a moment ago. The next moment, it suddenly appeared in front of Xiahou. The talisman lines on the arrow were slightly bright, and the remaining snowflakes were not blown away by the wind. At this moment, the primordial 13 arrows seemed to break through the constraints of distance and time. They were even no longer affected by the surrounding environment. The cold arrow pierced through Xiahou's close-fitting clothes. The qi of heaven and earth on the surface of his body suddenly sank. Xiahou felt something. He reached out and grasped the air. He only had time to hold the middle part of the arrow. There were probably only a few people in the world who could hold Ning Kai's primordial 13 arrows. The iron arrow made an ear-piercing sound in the iron palm. Sparks flew everywhere, illuminating the willows by the lake. Tomorrow is the 2nd anniversary of my marriage with my leader. I only write 1 chapter. From the day after tomorrow, I will write 2 chapters a day until the end of the month. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 479. The iron arrow in Xiahou's hand continued to move towards his chest and was about to pierce into his body. Xiahou's eyes suddenly lit up like stars. With a roar, the sparks caused by the friction between the iron arrow and his palm were extinguished instantly. A strong wind blew on the embankment and the willows were all broken, dancing wildly in the snow. Accompanied by the terrifying impact, Xiahou's body flew backward. His feet were like iron pillars stepping on the embankment, plowing 2 extremely deep ravines. If the Yanming Lake had not been frozen, the lake water would have flowed in. The cluster of the iron arrow pierced through the qi of heaven and earth on the surface of his body. It pierced through his clothes and skin, leaving a shallow wound from which a drop of blood slowly seeped out. Xiahou raised his head and looked towards the southern shore of the Yanming Lake. His dark face turned pale and he began to cough. Blood flowed from the corner of his mouth. There was an empty passage above the ice lake on a snowy night. There was no snow in it. Only then did the snow fall again and was crushed into pieces by the aftershock of the arrow. This was the art of archery. The other end of the arrow was on the cliff on the southern shore of the Yanming Lake. Xiahou finally confirmed Ning Kai's position. He looked over there expressionlessly and released a strong aura from his body. Snow and dust danced wildly and formed a circle among the swaying willows. Then the ground where his feet stood suddenly sank, forming a perfect circle of about 10 feet. Borrowing the terrifying counterforce, his body disappeared from the lake embankment, leaving only the lingering wind. A few pieces of snow fell. Xiahou left the embankment and began to run towards the southern shore of the lake. His feet stepped heavily on the surface of the lake. The ice of the Yanming Lake was extremely solid. Even with the impact of his body and high speed, it still did not break. However, every time he stepped, a few inconspicuous cracks would appear. Beneath the solid lake ice was the water. Feeling the mountain-like weight on the ice, it began to shake uneasily, making a dull and strange sound. It was as if drumsticks were beating heavily on a war drum, producing a dull thumping sound. This winter lake was his war drum. The frequency at which he struck the war drum was not high, but every strike was powerful. Xiahou's running pace was not fast. but every step he took seemed to cross mountains and rivers. In the blink of an eye, his figure had already appeared on the frozen Yanming Lake. If someone could see through the darkness of the night, perhaps they would be able to see the afterimage on the lake. An expert at the peak of the martial Tao possessed absolute power. When he transformed his power into speed, it was difficult to describe the terrifying degree with words or comparison. The night wind on the snow lake was certainly not as fast as this, and neither was the falling snow. Even if Ningke's talisman arrows were faster, there was no way he could hit such a fast target. On the battlefield, this was a very simple principle. Both Xiahou and Ningke had been through hundreds of battles, so they knew this very well. Xiahou had been vigilantly waiting for the legendary primordial 13 arrows, ever since he knew that Ningke was hostile to him. He thought for a long time and finally came to a conclusion. As long as he ran, the primordial 13 arrows would not pose any threat to him. His sturdy military boots cracked the ice on the lake and he arrived at the snowy lake. There were withered lotuses frozen in the water. They had long died and accumulated snow, looking very miserable. Just as Xiahou stepped on a withered lotus, the other withered lotuses next to it trembled, as if they had regained some kind of vitality. Then there was a loud bang. The ice on the winter lake cracked, the withered lotuses all collapsed, the fire burst and the airwaves rolled wildly. Xiahou's mountain-like body was actually shaken high up into the air. Among the fire and airwaves, there were countless shrill whistles and hissing sounds. The withered lotuses that were not shaken by the explosion seemed to have been cut by a sharp blade. They were all broken and turned into countless pieces. Xiahou landed heavily on the snow lake, splashing snowflakes. His knees were slightly bent and his military boots were torn, but his body was strong enough to maintain balance and did not fall. What followed him to the ground were countless extremely sharp and hard iron shards. The high-speed iron shards whistled and slashed the withered lotuses, then fell on the ice like rain. The sharp iron shards stuck to his body. The chi of heaven and earth on the surface of his body, at the most dangerous moment, blocked most of the power of the explosion and the cutting of the sharp iron shards. But there were still dozens of sharp iron shards that wedged into his body. Many wounds appeared on Xiahou's hard skin, and blood began to flow. At this moment, the second iron arrow arrived. It was sudden and without warning. Xiahou looked at the snow floating on the winter lake and timidly avoided it. He poured his chi into his right arm and waved it expressionlessly. This seemingly simple wave caused the night wind to blow on the snow lake and the ice to roll wildly. There was a sharp crack. A clear cut appeared on his right arm. The iron arrow was shaken and brushed past his body into the snow lake. With a boom, a dark and gloomy hole appeared on the extremely hard lake ice. Xiahou suddenly looked up and stared in the direction of the south bank. Then he began to run again. He confirmed that he had underestimated Ningke's means. But he could no longer retreat. He had to close the distance between him and Ningquebec. Therefore, no matter how many tricks were hidden in this winter lake, or how many explosions like the one before were hidden in the withered lotus field, he had to rush over. He continued to run into the lotus field. Then the second explosion occurred. The primordial 13 arrows could ignore the distance but not the moving speed of the target. Ningke also knew this. Moreover, Xiahou's devil's doctrine was extremely powerful. His physical strength was not comparable to Prince Longqing's. Therefore, he never expected to kill Xiahou with the primordial 13 arrows alone. Fortunately, there was a lotus field in Yanming Lake. In late spring, Ningke bought all the houses by the Yanming Lake and turned it into a lake in his backyard. He planted many lotus flowers in the lake. In midsummer, he and Sangsang boated on the lake and walked through the dense lotus field. They enjoyed the lake, the wind, the stars, and the lotus seeds. Then, they threw many small iron kettles into the lotus field. In winter, Yanming Lake was frozen. The surface of the ice was thick, and the lotus field had long withered. The small iron kettles that had sunk deep in the mud of the lotus field began to wake up. With the awakening of the small iron kettles, explosions sounded one after another on the snow lake. The blazing flames and terrifying waves of air shook the snow on the surface of the lake into the air. Countless sharp and hard pieces of metal whistled through the wind and snow. Many black holes appeared on the hard layer of ice on the lake. Between the whistling wind and the iron pieces, Xiaoho was already covered in blood. What was more terrifying was that every time he slowed down because of the explosion, Sang, who was holding the big black umbrella on the cliff of the south bank, would report his position. Then Ning Ke would shoot an arrow. The next moment, the terrifying and cold iron arrow would arrive in front of Xiaoho. The small iron kettles were flowers. Ning Ke and Sang had planted many lotuses in this winter lake, and the number of kettles they threw would be the same number of flowers on the lake tonight. The iron arrows were thorns. Ning Ke had 13 primordial 13 arrows in his arrow box. Then, he would definitely take advantage of the time when the snow lake was blooming to shoot all of them. I have reported to everyone that there are some things that I will not write today. I will try to write more tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 480. The winter lake should have been quiet and dark under the night snow. However, there was a strong gust of wind on the surface of the lake tonight, accompanied by terrifying explosions and sparks. Iron lotuses blossomed in the frozen lotus field. The thick snow on the surface of the lake was thrown up by an invisible force and sprinkled into the dark night sky. The thick layer of ice collapsed and exploded. The ink-like cold lake water kept slapping against the black hole, stirring up snow-like waves and then dissipating into the real snow. In the withered lotus field, Xiaoho was once again shaken by the air wave, accompanied by the sharp sound of iron shrapnel. His mountain-like body broke through the wind and seemed to be thrown above the night clouds. On the cliff of the south bank of Yanming Lake, Sang held the big black umbrella tightly in one hand and Ning Ke's clothes in the other. She lowered her head and closed her eyes. She did not look at the chaotic scene on the lake in front of the cliff, but she seemed to be able to clearly capture the position of everything. She whispered 2 numbers again. Hearing the 2 numbers, Ning Ke did not hesitate to draw his bow and shoot at the distant night clouds above. It was pitch black and he could not see clearly what was there, but he knew that Xiaoho was there. The sky was covered in a blizzard. It was pitch black and the arrow could not be seen. Only the sharp whistling of the primordial 13 arrows could be heard. When people heard the whistling of the arrows, it was already the next moment. The night clouds above Yanming Lake suddenly fluctuated and the chi of heaven and earth became chaotic. It was as if there was an explosion of thunder in the dark clouds, and the dim wisps of clouds fled in all directions. The night clouds suddenly broke and blood splashed. Xiaoho fell from the sky. This time he could no longer maintain his balance and smashed heavily on the ice, causing a few deep cracks to appear on the ice. A cold and dark iron arrow pierced deeply through his left arm. Because of anger and pain, Xiaoho's eyes seemed to be burning. He was like an injured beast king. He grabbed the tail of the iron arrow and pulled it out from his upper arm. He continued to run towards the south bank. He only had time to take 3 steps forward. At the bottom of the lotus field, there was another powerful explosion in the mud. The layer of ice under his feet suddenly cracked, almost swallowing his body into the dark and cold lake water. What followed were the heat waves, flames, and the extremely sinister and terrifying sharp iron pieces. When the waves in the lake passed through the ice and reached the feet of the military boots, Xiaoho made the most timely response with the ability of a powerhouse at the peak of martial arts. With a heavy step, he left the frozen surface of the lake and flew into the air. Then he raised his fists in front of him as fast as lightning. Xiaoho let out a muffled groan as he was sent flying hundreds of feet away until he was out of the lotus field. His arms and the parts of his body that could not be covered by his arms had dozens of small pieces of iron. Blood seeped out of the wounds, looking like red grass in the wilderness in autumn. Although Xiaoho was a powerhouse at the peak state of martial arts, his spirit and chi and blood had been severely depleted after continuously withstanding the explosions in the lotus field, especially the primordial 13 arrows from Ning Quebec. The chi of heaven and earth that had condensed on the surface of his body had dissipated, and could no longer protect his body. His skin, which was as hard as metal under the effect of the devil's doctrine's genuine chi, now had numerous wounds on it. Although there were no fatal injuries, his bloody appearance made him look extremely pathetic. At this moment, another primordial 13 arrow pierced through the burning lotus and snow, silently arriving in front of Xiaoho, not giving him any chance to breathe. Xiahou put his palms together and forcibly clamped the terrifying iron arrow in front of him. His body retreated another 100 feet on the ice. The ice and snow under his body splashed everywhere. His face was pale, and more blood flowed from the corner of his mouth. Ningke stood under the cliff on the south bank of Yanming Lake, silently watching all the movements on the surface of the lake. When Xiahou was once again blown up and retreated, he used the flash of light from the explosion to determine Xiahou's position. After hearing Song Song's position, he stroked the bowstring with his fingers. Archery was the most powerful skill of the woodcutter at Shibi Lake. However, in the past, ordinary bows and arrows did not mean much to martial arts cultivators. But once a weapon like the primordial 13 arrow appeared in the world, Ningke would become a nightmare for all cultivators in a sense. Ningke's shooting was not fast, but there was a very strange sense of rhythm. From the moment Sang Sang reported the position to the moment the iron arrow left the bowstring, the process was so smooth that there seemed to be no waiting. There was some kind of truth hidden in the process. In the face of such powerful archery, and more importantly, with Sang Sang beside him, Xiahou could not avoid those silent but powerful iron arrows no matter how strong he was. He could only resist, endure, and continue to bleed. It all depended on whether his blood would run out when Ningke finished shooting the 13 iron arrows, and whether he could rush to Ningke's side. The speed of the primordial 13 arrow was too shocking, far faster than the speed of sound. So only when it hit the target would the sound of the arrow travel diagonally in both directions. By the wooden bridge on the west bank of Yanming Lake, the reeds suddenly swayed. Yi Hongyu's green Taoist robe fluttered, and then she heard the sound of the arrow. Primordial 13 arrow? Yi Hongyu was slightly shocked. She had seen the primordial 13 arrow on the snow cliff in the wilderness and by the Daming Lake. She knew the power of the talisman arrow that gathered the wisdom of the second floor of the academy. However, the wind and snow were chaotic tonight, the reeds were swaying, and her green Taoist robe was fluttering in the lingering sound of the arrow. Only then did she realize that in less than a year, Ningke's primordial 13 arrow had become even more terrifying. Then the explosion in the lotus field of Yanming Lake spread to the snow bridge. She frowned and said, "What is this?" Explosions after explosions, flashes after flashes of fire, shrill screeches of spinning metal pieces, and the terrifying arrow intent in the night snow made her face paler and paler. She looked at the lake in the east and suddenly said something very puzzling, "I'm dead." Chun Pippi and Tang Xiaotang had been standing on the other side of the wooden bridge. They were watching the battle on the lake, worried about Ningke and Sang Sang, and were silent. Yi Hongyu did not know what the explosion was, but Chun Pippi had seen the small iron kettle experiment, but he did not explain. Just when Yi Hongyu said those 3 words, he looked at the distant arrow and the thunderous fire, and said with a complicated expression, "I'm dead too." They were still standing on the wooden bridge, so naturally they were not dead. But when they heard the explosion and the arrow coming from Yanming Lake, they both said the same thing. "I'm dead." Yi Hongyu was the Tao addict of the West Hill Divine Palace, and Chun Pippi was the youngest grand cultivator in the Knowing Destiny state in the world. They were the most talented and powerful young people in Haotian Taoism. The reason why they said "I'm dead" was because they were watching the battle in silence. They were sure that if they were in Xiahou's position, facing Ningke's 15 years of painstaking preparation from summer to winter, they would only be able to hold on until this moment and then die. On the snowy city wall, Yisu said, "I never thought that a cultivator in the see-through state could make such a big noise. It seems that I have underestimated Ning Quebec. But what's with the explosion in the lotus field?" Eldest brother did not speak. As the eldest brother of the academy, he naturally knew what was going on. But like Chun Pippi, he would not tell others about his youngest brother's trump card. Yisu looked at the direction of Yanming Lake and was silent for a long time. He slowly shook his head and said, "If Ningke's methods were used to deal with other cultivators, it would be a deadly weapon. But to kill Xiahou with talismans, arrows, and these strange explosions, it is still not enough." The snow on Yanming Lake gradually stopped, but the snowstorm in the palace continued. Under the night snow, the main hall was brightly lit and silent. Naturally, there were no cicadas chirping. Everyone knew what was happening in Chang'an. So everyone inside and outside the main hall had a strange look on their faces. The guards held the cold hilts of their swords and stood guard outside the hall. The eunuchs and palace maids lowered their heads and walked slowly, making sure that when their feet touched the ground, there would be no sound. The Tang Emperor did not wear his regular clothes tonight. Instead, he wore a bright yellow dragon robe. He leaned on the soft couch and read a scroll in his hand, but no one knew if he could focus on it. The Empress sat on the chair beside the couch. Her gentle and elegant face was expressionless today. One could vaguely see worry and anger in the depths of her eyes. The nation master of Tang, Li Qingshan, and the emperor's younger brother, Master Huangyang, sat opposite each other in front of the couch. Today, many powerhouses gathered in Chang'an, so the two most powerful and trustworthy sublime people of the imperial court had to be in the palace. The emperor slowly put down the scroll in his hand and looked at the falling snow outside the hall. He looked in the direction of Yanming Lake in the south and frowned slightly. No one knew what he was thinking about. Although Xiahou was the empress' elder brother, from an emotional point of view, His Majesty hoped that Ningke could win. Because His Majesty had always regarded himself as a student of the headmaster of academy, then in his eyes, Ningke was his younger brother. What a majestic aura! Li Qingshan felt the fluctuation of the qi of heaven and earth from Yanming Lake and said, Ningke's talisman arrow is really terrifying. The Empress suddenly raised her head and looked at the Emperor. She said in a trembling voice, gathering the wisdom of the Academy's back mountain and the power of the Tang Empire to create such a talisman arrow. Is this fair? The Emperor was silent. He did not want to make his wife more upset. Master Huangyang, who had been silent, suddenly said calmly, It's fair. It's just that Ningke has prepared for a longer time. He has prepared for 15 years. After saying this, he and Li Qingshan left their seats and walked out into the snow outside the hall, leaving the quiet and complicated palace to the Emperor and the Empress. There was a pavilion at the back of the main hall, and an ancient bell hung in the pavilion. There was a thick layer of snow on the eaves of the pavilion, and a light layer of snow on the ancient bell. Li Qingshan and Huangyang walked into the pavilion and stood beside the ancient bell. Li Qingshan looked to the south and said with a deep frown, It's still not enough. Monk Huangyang said, I didn't expect that you also hoped that Ningke would win. Li Qingshan said, People's emotions are uncontrollable. Although Xiahou is an elder of our Haotian Taoism, Ningke is my senior brother's only successor. Then he said with slight sadness, He has prepared for 15 years, but it's still not enough. Monk Huangyang reached out his palm and gently wiped the snow on the ancient bell. He said, When Ningke entered Talisman Taoism, he once came to the Wanyan Tower to ask me. I also hoped that he could win, but I had my own thoughts. If the one who prepared for a longer time would win, then what's the point of cultivation? The blizzard abruptly stopped, and the airwaves caused by the explosion gradually subsided. The night wind also became much gentler. Yanming Lake was quiet in the middle of the night. The night clouds on the lake gradually parted, revealing a gap. A few stars popped out of the gap and looked curiously at the ground, trying to see what had happened. Most of the night sky was still covered by thick black clouds. The few stars disappeared as soon as they appeared, but some light shone down, making things slightly visible. It was a mess on the ice surface of the snow lake. The withered lotus had long been broken into powder, and dozens of faint black holes appeared in the lotus field. It was chilling to see. A burly man knelt on one knee on the ice in front of those black holes. His clothes were in tatters, and it was unknown if there were dozens or hundreds of pieces of metal. Blood continuously flowed from his body, finally flowing onto the snow on the surface of the lake, dyeing the snow around his knees dark red. The red on the winter night was actually more like black. The place where the burly man knelt was only a few hundred feet away from the south bank of Yanming Lake. Ningke stood on the cliff by the lake and stared at the lake. In order to fight and shoot arrows, he wore a black academy uniform. The sleeves and trousers were tied tightly by sangsang with cloth ropes. At this moment, his body, especially his right arm, was trembling violently, so the black academy uniform flapped in the lake wind. Using the primordial 13 arrows consumed a lot of physical strength and psyche power. Ningke could only shoot a few arrows in the past. Now that he had successfully cultivated the Great Spirit, it was still a great burden for him to shoot all 13 iron arrows in the quiver. In addition to the hundreds of talismans in the lakeside house and the small iron kettle in the mud at the bottom of the lake, he had used all his means. At this moment, the psyche power in his sense of perception was almost exhausted. His eyes were abnormally bright, and his face was abnormally pale and haggard. His right arm was extremely weak, and his right shoulder felt as if it was being torn apart. He was so weak that he could fall at any time. But he did not fall. He waited for Xiaohou to fall first on the lake. Xiaohou knelt on one knee on the snow lake. In the end, he did not manage to block Ningke's last primordial 13 arrow. The cold and dark iron arrow directly pierced through his calf bone. If it was an ordinary cultivator who was shot by this iron arrow, his leg would definitely be broken. Xiaohou was not an ordinary cultivator. His leg was not broken, and the iron arrow did not even pierce through his leg. However, this caused him more serious injuries and more pain. Xiaohou reached out his right hand to hold the iron arrow in his calf. He wanted to pull the arrow out, but his hands were trembling so badly that he did not succeed. He added his left hand with a blank expression. His two iron hands suddenly exerted force, and the hard iron arrow was actually broken in the middle. This action would definitely bring great pain. Xiaohou's iron eyebrows twitched violently. His lips, which looked like they were smeared with rouge, opened and let out a shrill howl. The shrill and terrifying howl reverberated on the quiet snow lake. It shook the ice and snow, and even the willows by the shore danced. Xiaohou's knees gradually straightened and he stood up. At this moment, he was covered in blood and looked extremely miserable. However, when he stood on the snow lake, he was extremely domineering, like an indestructible mountain. He was more like the blood flag outside the courtyard on the north shore of Yanming Lake. That blood flag whistled and danced in the cold wind, but it seemed as if it would never fall. Xiaohou looked at the cliff on the south cliff. His pale face was devoid of any expression, and his trembling voice was clearly filled with pain. However, his words were still filled with an insufferably arrogant aura. Ningke, is that all? There's more today. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 481. Is this all you've got? Do you think you can kill me like this? I haven't even used my most powerful move. Don't tell me you can't do it. A shrill howl reverberated across the snow lake. Xiaohou walked towards the southern shore of Yanming Lake in the night. Because of his leg injury, he walked very slowly. His voice trembled a little, but his footsteps were still as steady as ever. His aura was still as strong as ever, unparalleled in the world. Ningke, who was standing on the edge of the cliff, looked at Xiaohou, who was walking slowly on the ice surface of the lake. His face was expressionless, but he felt a little strange. He felt the coldness brought by the wind and snow. The primordial 13 arrows in the arrow box had been shot out. The hundreds of food papers that he had accumulated over the past 2 years had turned into a yellow waterfall and colorful storm in the house on the north bank. The small iron kettles in the mud at the bottom of the lake had all exploded. He seemed to have used his most powerful move, but he still could not kill Xiaohou. He could not even stop Xiaohou from walking slowly toward the south bank. Was this the power of a powerhouse at the peak of martial arts? The snowflakes falling on the city wall had become much sparser. Eldest brother looked in the direction of Yanming Lake. His clean eyes could not hide his worried expression. The old cotton-padded jacket on him trembled slightly, as if it was hesitating to float up. Yisu's expression was slightly stern. He did not expect that the battle on the winter lake would present such a situation. From the beginning to the present, Xiaohou had been completely restrained and had suffered such heavy injuries. I have to admit that Ningke has given me a lot of surprises. The last disciple of the headmaster of academy is indeed not an ordinary person, but it is a pity that he will die tonight. He looked at eldest brother and said, "Unless you make a move." Eldest senior brother understood the meaning of this sentence. Tonight, all the powerhouses in the world had gathered in Chang'an City. Only he and Junemo from the academy were here to create a fair environment for Ningquebec. Junemo was responsible for watching the Tang military, while he was responsible for watching the peerless genius of Hautian Taoism. Correspondingly, He and Junemo were also being watched by the other party. If he made a move, then Yisu would definitely make a move. Eldest brother's expression gradually became gentle and calm as if he had thought of something. Teacher often asks me to learn from junior brother. And I've been thinking about what I should learn. Now that I think about it, it's to learn from his attitude when he's in trouble. He looked in the direction of Yanming Lake and said, "The most admirable thing about youngest brother is himself. He is his own sky and has no limits. When everyone in the world thinks that he can't do it, he can always take another step forward and climb another step on the stone steps." He was like this when he entered the academy, when he entered the old academy, and when he climbed the mountain path to the second floor. How could there be an accident tonight? There were many torches lit outside the Yulin Royal Guards barracks, illuminating the surroundings. The snow bridge outside the barracks looked like a jade belt, and the man wearing a tall crown on the snow bridge looked like an immortal on the jade belt. As the wind and snow drifted, time continued to pass. From day to night, it was unknown how much time had passed, but the confrontation on the snowy bridge continued. The second brother of the academy, Junemo, had been sitting on the snow bridge. The Defender General of the state, Su Shi, and the powerful Yulin Royal Guards had been staying under the snow bridge. General Su Shi leaned against the railing under the snow bridge and looked at second brother, who was sitting cross-legged on the snow bridge. He coughed painfully and said, "Ning Kei's challenge to Xiahou, in my opinion, is a challenge to the dignity of the Tang military, so I want to stop this battle from happening." Second brother slowly raised his head and looked at the leader of the Tang military. The thin snow covering his eyebrows fell, and he said, "Since the battle has begun, there's no need for words." "Yes, there's no need for words." Su Shi raised his eyebrows and looked at second brother angrily. "So you want Ning Kei to die?" Second brother said, "Since the battle has begun, there will be life and death. As soldiers of the Tang Empire, don't you understand this simple truth?" After a short pause, he said coldly, "Moreover, Xiahou is not a great figure. Who dares to say that my youngest brother will definitely lose?" In the eyes of Mr. Second of the Academy, Xiahou, the general of the Tang Empire, was indeed not a terrifying opponent. But now it was Ning Kei who was fighting against Xiahou. Su Shi thought so and then said indifferently, "There are no miracles in the world." Second brother looked at him and said seriously, "The Academy is a place to create miracles. If I can't kill this person after 15 years of preparation, then the rest can only depend on destiny." But the teacher said that there is no destiny in the world. Ning Kei thought so while standing on the cliff. He looked up at the sky and then looked down at the person walking on the snow lake. He slowly raised his eyebrows and asked, "Can we really succeed?" After the arrow box was empty, Sang Sang opened her eyes. She held the big black umbrella and looked at Ning Kei's eyes. She nodded very hard and said, "Because we have to succeed." Ning Kei laughed and thought that was true. No matter whether destiny existed or not, no matter whether he could succeed or not, he had to succeed. Then he should not think about anything else other than success. He looked at the domineering figure on the snow lake and said, "You only have a pair of weak fists and half a broken body. I have a fresh knife, why can't I kill you?" On the snow lake, Xiahou's body slightly paused. In this moment of stagnation, Ning Kei stretched out his right hand and held the hilt in the cold wind. His fingers felt the familiar touch of the velvet grass and suddenly tightened. With a clang, he pulled out the padao from the sheath. Many years ago, Ning Kei had gotten used to carrying 3 knives in order to deal with Xiahou's team of 3 assassins. Later, he no longer needed to deal with those assassins but only Xiahou himself. So he asked the 6th brother of the academy to combine the 3 knives into one. The knife was long and thin but extremely heavy. Its lines were smooth but not beautiful. The blade was not shiny but plain. It was a knife used to kill people. Ning Kei held the knife with one hand and rushed down the cliff. The cliff was very steep. He was getting faster and faster until he was about to turn into a black shadow. The shadow behind the black shadow was the shadow of the knife. For some reason, Ning Kei insisted on not carving talisman lines on the knife. Instead, he kept it as it was, smooth and simple to the extreme. It was probably because he wanted to display the simplest swordsmanship. Because he firmly believed that the simplest was the most powerful. just like when he rushed down the cliff and slashed at the powerful man on the snow lake. He was clearly more than 100 feet away from Xiahou, but his knife momentum had appeared in advance. It was to rush straight, then sweep, then raise, and finally slash down. That was what Ning Kai was going to do. He knew that Xiahou could understand what he was going to do. He wanted to know how Xiahou would take it. If Xiahou really took it, then he believed that it would be his chance. Xiahou did not choose to forcefully take Ning Kai's long-prepared strike. He also did not fight back with his iron fists as he usually did. He also did not deal with the assassins from the Yan Kingdom like he did in the military camp, where he roared like thunder and turned two powerhouses in the see-through state into idiots. This was because he had been injured by Tang. His armor had been broken by the blood cutlass of the Devil's Doctrine. Many of Tang's fists were still hidden in his body. He was not in his peak state. Moreover, he had also been injured by Ning Kai's talisman storm and the attack of arrows and flowers. Xiahou did not choose to avoid the knife. As a strong man at the peak state of martial arts, he was best at close combat. Why would he be afraid of this simple but powerful knife momentum? He had said before that he had not used his most powerful move. Now he finally moved. He stood on the snow lake and closed his eyes. His bleeding hands reached into the cold night wind. The psyche power in his sense of perception gushed out through the ocean of qi and mountain of snow. It immediately blended into the qi of heaven and earth around Yanming Lake and formed a rope. It traveled several miles in an instant and landed somewhere on the north bank. Outside the courtyard on the north bank of Yanming Lake, there was a blood-colored military flag. That was Xiahou's flag. The military flag that was slowly fluttering in the night wind seemed to have heard a military order. It suddenly tightened and danced uneasily in front of the courtyard gate, like a monster that wanted to break free from its chains and fight at the front line. Previously, before Xiahou entered the courtyard, he had inserted the military flag deep into the stone ground, causing several cracks to appear beside the flagpole. At this time the military flag was fluttering restlessly, the flagpole was shaking non-stop, and the cracks on the ground suddenly became deeper and wider, spreading out in all directions, looking like a spider web. With a cracking sound, the stone ground under the flagpole cracked and gravel flew everywhere. The blood-colored military flag struggled out of the ground and flew towards Yanming Lake. There was a hurricane in front of the courtyard. The blood flag that was torn into pieces by the wind fell down. In the low night clouds above Yanming Lake, there was a terrifying buzzing sound and a black shadow could be seen faintly. It was as if a saint was riding a sword in the clouds. Ning Kai did not know that a strange scene had happened in front of his courtyard. He did not even know that the blood-colored military flag had been broken and only the flagpole was left roaring in the clouds. He was sprinting on the cliff. In his eyes there was only Xiahou's figure 1,000 feet away. However, at this moment he suddenly felt a sense of danger. A fragment in the depths of his sense of perception suddenly lit up. In the blink of an eye, his right foot stomped heavily on a protruding rock on the cliff wall. He used the force to forcefully twist his body in the air and faced Yiyun. The great spirit in his body surged into his arms, and he brandished the heavy and sturdy padao in front of him, forming an impenetrable blade pattern. Wherever the blade pattern swept past, the cliff rocks flew everywhere. The night clouds above the lake suddenly became chaotic. A black shadow in the shape of a stick broke through the clouds and landed on the edge of the cliff in an instant. It was extremely unreasonable and ruthlessly stabbed into the padao in front of him. There was a loud bang. Ning Kai felt an uncontrollable huge force passing through the padao to his body. His body was still in the air when he suddenly suffered a heavy blow. He fell heavily and then accelerated his fall, crashing into the snow lake at the bottom of the cliff, stirring up waves of snow high into the sky. Ning Kai stood up from the snow and wiped the blood from the corner of his lips. He looked at the dark stick-like object in Xiahou's hand, and a strong sense of alarm rose in his heart. Xiahou looked at him and his eyes gradually narrowed. He seemed to have discovered something very strange. Ning Kai asked, "What is this?" Xiahou said, "A spear." Only the flagpole was left of the blood-colored military flag. The flagpole was the spear. Let me first say that tomorrow's chapter is called Open Spear. P.S. A friend has written a xianxia book called The Brave General. The book number is 2093193. It has already exceeded 2 million words and is about to reach 2,000 subscriptions. It is fighting to be published. If you are interested in xianxia books, you may want to take a look. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 482. The iron spear was the flagpole of the blood flag, so it was especially long. When it landed on the ice, it was much taller than Xiaoho's burly body. The body of the spear was dark and gloomy. It was straight and smooth without any carvings on the surface. The only difference between it and a stick was that one end was extremely sharp and shining. Although Ningke had reacted in advance at the most critical moment and saved his life, his arms were still in great pain from the shock, as if his bones were broken. As for his chest and abdomen, he felt extremely uncomfortable, as if blood was slowly gathering there. The flag was broken and the pole was sent flying. An iron spear came from several li away, piercing through the clouds, and yet it was able to smash him into such a sorry state that he almost lost his life. It was really hard to imagine how much power this spear contained. It was not until then that Ningke realized that Xiaoho's most powerful skill was not the overbearing devil's doctrine's qi in his body, but the iron spear that could break through the clouds at any time. No one knew that Xiaoho was good at using spears, not even he. This black iron spear was used by Xiaoho as a flying sword. How could a powerhouse at the peak state of martial arts from the devil's doctrine possess such exquisite and powerful Haotian Taoism skills? The iron spear stood on the snow lake, exuding an undisguised sense of power. It openly announced its existence and killing intent to the opponent and the nature around the lake. Ningke raised his right arm and wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. He asked, "What's the name of this spear?" "An open spear." Xiaoho said, "You have a hidden arrow, and I have an open spear." Ningke coughed up a mouthful of blood and gasped. "Good spear, good name." Xiaoho looked at the slender padao in his right hand and squinted. "You also have a good blade." It was indeed a good blade. Otherwise, it would not have been able to resist the iron spear that broke through the clouds and fell from the sky. It would have broken into countless pieces in an instant. Xiaoho said expressionlessly, "But in the world, except for Liu Bai's sword, who is qualified to fight against my spear?" Since he betrayed the devil's doctrine and pledged his loyalty to Haotian Taoism, Xiaoho had been silently preparing to deal with Master Lotus, who might still be alive, and especially the 23-year cicada cultivation, which could not possibly die quietly. His preparation was the iron spear in his hand. This spear was personally forged by him. The spear intent of the spear came from the Abbey Dean of the Jishou Abbey. In these years of cultivation, Xiaoho forcefully went against the cultivation method and forcefully cultivated the Taoist cultivation method. Unexpectedly, he successfully cultivated the iron spear into his natal item. From that day onwards, this spear finally gained a brand new spear intent. Xiaoho thought that it was light, or rather, he hoped that there would be light in the future, so he named this iron spear Open Spear. With the spear in the open in his hand, Xiaoho dared to look directly at Mingzong spying in the dark. Not to mention the ordinary saber in Ningke's hand. When the crimson flag was torn to shreds, the flagpole turned into a spear and flew into the night clouds. Eldest brother, who was on the city wall, noticed it. He subconsciously took a step forward and placed his hands on the top of the city wall. He did not feel the cold snow on the top of the wall, and looked in the direction of Yanming Lake with a worried expression. One could imagine the power of Xiaoho's spear, which could make the eldest brother of the academy so solemn and worried, and how much of an impact it would have on the hearts of the spectators tonight. The eldest brother murmured, "I did not expect General Xiaoho to have hidden such a move in the end. The speed, strength, and momentum of this spear can be said to be perfect." Yisu said, "I remember Master once said that when he led Xiaoho into the Tao sect, he once tried to make him break away from the devil's doctrine's cultivation method and switch to Tao law. I didn't expect Xiaoho to actually switch to Tao law and cultivate this spear to such a level. It is really incredible." The eldest brother was slightly moved and said, "So it was taught by the Abbey Dean. No wonder it is so domineering." "It is not domineering, it is open and aboveboard." Yisu said, If Xiahou could cultivate the open spear to absolute light, he would probably be able to compete with Lu Bai at his peak. The eldest brother shook his head and said, "Let's not talk about General Xiahou's injury, and just talk about the state of the open spear. It is still a distance away from Mr. Lu Bai's sword style." Yisu said, "The distance is the distance from Lu Bai, but it is not something that Ningke can handle." The eldest brother was silent. After withstanding the extremely domineering open spear, Ningke had suffered a terrible impact and his internal injuries were gradually showing. He needed time to recover, so he was willing to say a few more words. Although Xiahou was also seriously injured, he should have chosen to launch a thunderous attack and smash Ningke into meat paste before his blood ran dry. However, he did not know why he gave Ningke time to say a few words. Because he had some doubts in his heart, so he was vigilant. For the battle on the snow lake tonight, Ningke had prepared for 15 years. Xiahou did not have a long time to prepare, but he had decades of experience on the bloody battlefield. He was one of the 4 great generals of the Tang Empire. People were often attracted by his ruthless and cold-blooded side, and forgot his talent in military affairs. In fact, his commanding ability on the battlefield was not weaker than his powerful strength. What was more frightening was that he was very good at using the art of war in a cultivator's battle. From the moment he stepped into the house by the Yanming Lake and planted the flag in the ground, Xiahou had been acting according to the art of war. He used his body as the middle military tent and kept showing weakness to the enemy. He even did not hesitate to use a large number of troops to resist Ningke's most powerful means. Until the enemy was exhausted and he clearly saw all the means of the enemy, he used his most powerful means, intending to kill the enemy with one strike. For the last strike he had paid such a big price, consumed so much energy and lost so much blood. Then the last strike must be like a thunderbolt, not giving the enemy any chance. The blood flag in front of the house was equivalent to the thousands of black armored cavalries lying in ambush around the battlefield. They were waiting for the enemy to attack suddenly when they could not take down the enemy for a long time, like the wind sweeping up the fallen leaves to determine the victory. The elite black armored cavalries of the Tang Empire were the most powerful and terrifying iron stream in the military camp. The iron cavalry had been accumulating power for a long time, so they would definitely sweep the field and be unstoppable. The iron spear and the blood flag was Xiahou's most powerful and terrifying means. He only released it at the last moment, so it was naturally the key to victory. This spear condensed the strong faith and momentum of a powerhouse at the peak state of martial arts. Logically speaking, even a cultivator stronger than Ningke could not resist it. However, Ningke did not die even though the iron spear had struck him like a thunderbolt in the dark clouds. Although he was coughing up blood and was obviously seriously injured, the fact that he was not dead still made Xiahou feel extremely puzzled. During the short conversation with Ningke, Xiahou thought about this problem, trying to find the source of his confusion and inexplicable vigilance and a solution. After a moment he figured out half of the answer. So he looked at Ningke with eyes that became brighter and colder, just like the scattered ice on the snow lake in front of him. It was enough for him to figure out half of the answer. At least he thought it was enough to solve the confusion and vigilance in his heart. He waved his right arm, and the remaining silky clothes on his arm instantly turned into powder. The blood from the wound sprayed into the night like arrows, and the iron spear in his hand broke through the air and disappeared instantly. Xiahou's second spear was not aimed at Ningke at the bottom of the cliff, but at Sang Sang at the top of the cliff. He had enough intelligence sources to know that it must be Ningke's little handmaiden on the cliff. He knew that the little handmaiden had a special relationship with Ningke, and he also knew that the little handmaiden was the successor of Wei Guangming. Song Song's identity and origin had always made Xiahou feel a little strange and vigilant, so he decided to kill her first. This decision was still based on the art of war. The art of war was not sinister or complicated. Instead, it was simple and upright, just like the temperament of the iron spear itself. Xiahou wanted to clearly tell Ningke that he wanted to kill Sang Sang. He wanted Ningke to turn back to save her, and then die. Sang Sang was Ningke's life. If someone dared to use Sang Sang to threaten him, he would definitely kill the other party at all costs, just like how he had shot Long Qing in the wilderness. And for ordinary people, when such a thin and weak girl, who was more precious than life, was threatened by death, they would immediately turn back to save her, disregarding their own lives. But Ning-Ke did not do so. When he sensed the majestic and domineering iron spear piercing the cliff, he did not turn back. Instead, he gripped the hilt of his knife tightly and stepped heavily on the ice with his right foot. His body instantly flew more than 100 feet above the snow lake. With a flick of his wrist, he raised the sharp padao and rushed towards Xiaohou. His speed was very shocking. The cold wind on the snow lake blew at his black academy uniform, making the sleeves of his clothes flutter, like the night sky that was about to disperse. Xiaohou raised his eyebrows slightly, somewhat puzzled. He stretched out his iron-like right hand and grasped the air in the night wind. The iron spear pierced through the air and instantly came to the cliff on the south bank of Yanming Lake. It stabbed towards Sang Sang. Because of the intense friction with the air, the dark body of the spear glowed with a bright luster. Compared to Song Song's thin and short body, it looked extraordinarily thick and terrifying. The wind of the spear wrapped around the remaining snow on the cliff and blew against her face, causing her cheeks to hurt. Her slightly yellow hair, which had been cut short, fell backwards like watergrass in a steep stream. She knew that Ning-Ke would not turn back to save her, because he could not save her in time. Because Ning-Ke believed that she could save her, and because at this moment she had to save herself. Although Sang Sang was the successor of the divine priest of light and had learned divine skills from the old man, and had verified with the Tao addict, Yi Hongyu these days, she had never participated in a battle between cultivators. She did not know how to fight and did not know how to save herself. Relying on her instinct, she crouched down like an injured little beast, just like when she was in a life and death situation in Min Mountain many years ago. She hugged the handle of the umbrella tightly, desperately shrinking her body so that the big black umbrella could cover every part of her body. A very strange sound rang out on the cliff, like a drumstick falling heavily on a broken drum. It also sounded like Xiaohou's footsteps that had crossed the rivers and mountains, breaking through the ice and falling into the water. The iron spear stabbed into the big black umbrella fiercely. The sharp tip of the spear pierced through the years of grease and black mud. The place where the big black umbrella and the iron spear touched sank rapidly. The black cloth made a hissing sound, as if it had become a terrible black hole. However, at the bottom of the black hole, the tip of the spear could not penetrate the umbrella. The handle of the big black umbrella pressed against the cliff stone. With a puff, it pierced in like a knife cutting through tofu. Gravel flew everywhere. Sang Sang, who had been hiding under the umbrella with her eyes closed, shook heavily. Her face suddenly became extremely pale. With a cry, blood spurted from her lips and dyed her new clothes red this morning. Let's not talk about today's endless bitter things. I will continue to write the next chapter and try to finish it before 11 o'clock. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 483. Xiaohou, who had betrayed the devil's doctrine, had that terrifying open spear as his natal item. He could clearly perceive all the details before the iron spear, so he knew that Sang Sang was not dead. The first shot, which he sought to kill with great perseverance and forbearance, failed to kill Ning Quebec. The second shot, which was based on the art of war, also failed to kill the little handmaiden on the cliff. Xiaohou's mood became a little strange after failing twice in a row. Ning-Ke had already crossed dozens of feet and arrived at the snow lake. At this moment, Xiaohou frowned slightly and tightened his right palm in the cold wind. The iron spear on the cliff suddenly shrank back, as if it had been bounced back into the air by the big black umbrella. The dark iron spear pierced through the remaining snow floating on the lake and the slightest cold wind. With a sharp whistle, it stabbed towards Ning-Ke's back like lightning. The sharp whistle was the sound of wind breaking and the sound of turbulence in front of the sharp tip of the spear. The sharper the sound, the faster the speed. Just from the sound, one could tell that this iron spear was extremely terrifying even if it was not as fast as the primordial 13 arrows. Logically speaking, with Ning-Ke's current cultivation and strength in the upper see-through state, there was no way to predict the trajectory of Xiaohou's open spear in advance, let alone deal with such a terrifying speed. But Ning-Ke had never been a reasonable person. His life experience and cultivation process, if one thought about it carefully, did not make any sense at all. Just when the iron spear was 30 feet away from his back, before the shrill sound reached his ears, he once again reacted in advance. He infused his whole body with the Great Spirit and forcefully twisted his body in the night sky. He concentrated all his spirit and strength on the blade and fiercely slashed behind him. An extremely clear and crisp sound accompanied by a strong splashing airflow spread from the blade and the tip of the spear to the surroundings, causing the snow on the winter lake to tremble. Ninkei felt a sharp pain in his wrist and almost lost his grip on the padao in his hand. However, he steadied his body with an extremely determined mind. Borrowing the recoil force from the blade, he spun in the night wind and whizzed towards Xiahou again. His speed was even faster than before. The iron spear drew an arc in the night sky and arrived in front of Xiahou earlier than Ninkei, returning to his right palm that was held in the cold wind. The cold wind suddenly picked up, and Ninkei broke through the wind, holding the padao with both hands and chopping down. Xiahou was already bathed in blood and his face was pale. However, his expression was still as majestic as before. Looking at the figure that was pouncing towards him like a ghost, he simply thrust his spear forward. The tip of the spear shone brightly. After a loud and clear sound, Ninkei flew backwards like an injured bird and fell heavily on the snow lake again. The dark iron spear trembled at an extremely high frequency in Xiahou's hand, unable to calm down for a long time. It emitted a low buzzing sound that chilled one's heart. Every time the iron spear and the padao collided, it was simple and unadorned, full of strength. It seemed simple and boring, but in reality, it contained the power to split mountains and split lakes. Ninkei stood up, feeling as if his wrist had been broken. His face was as pale as snow. Although Xiahou had been severely injured by his talisman arrow, he was still far from his opponent in terms of strength and the density of his qi. There was no way to make up for or close the gap. Xiahou's simple spear had broken Ninkei's long-planned and life-risking attack. There should be no reason for him to be dissatisfied, but his brows were deeply furrowed, because this spear had still not pierced Ninkei's body. Just at that moment, when the open spear was like the blazing sun and was about to tear apart the darkness on Ninkei's body, the padao in Ninkei's hand had mysteriously flipped out of nowhere and hit the tip of the spear. Then, his body had borrowed the momentum to fly backwards, but he had not been thrown out by the spear tip. Xiahou narrowed his eyes and looked at Ning Quebec. He said, "In the spring, when you secluded yourself in the cliff cave of the Academy's back mountain, you were indeed not cultivating both talisman and martial arts. Instead, you have joined the devil." Ninkei spat a mouthful of blood-stained saliva into the snow in front of him and did not reply. Previously, Xiahou had figured out half of the answer. The answer was that Ninkei had joined the devil. Otherwise, if he was an ordinary cultivator, he would not have been able to withstand the great power carried by the iron spear. But that was only half of the answer. Xiahou had attacked Ninkei 3 times tonight, and every spear was a work of great spirit. He believed that even the masters of the devil's doctrine back then could not have withstood it. Ninkei should have died, but he was still alive. Every time at the most critical moment, when the shadow of death from the spear tip was about to cover his body, he could always react in advance, and it was the most correct response. Xiahou was suddenly alarmed. Even if Ninkei joined the devil, it could not explain how he could do this, because this meant that he had the deepest understanding of the surrounding qi of heaven and earth. In other words, Ninkei seemed to have the fighting consciousness of the knowing destiny state tonight. The snow on the city wall gradually stopped, but it seemed colder than before. Eldest brother and Yisu looked in the direction of Yanming Lake, and the breath they exhaled permeated the surroundings like fog. Yisu did not expect that Ninkei could actually withstand Xiahou's open spear. Although he was extremely embarrassed, he did not die after all. This made him puzzled and even a little shocked. Although Xiahou's open spear was dark and left no trace in the night clouds, it was a righteous one. It used speed, strength, and momentum to suppress the opponent, forcing the opponent to fight to the death. With Ninkei's current level of consciousness, he could not even capture the movement of the open spear, let alone predict the opponent's movements. He could only take it head-on. Moreover, his cultivation state was only in the see-through state, and he did not have the ability to use the chi of heaven and earth as a means of attack. So when Xiahou used the first spear, he should have already died. Xiahou's open spear naturally could not stab you, Mr. First. Yisu glanced at eldest brother and continued, if it was Liu Bai, he would definitely hold his sword hilt upside down and use the surging yellow waves to attack and kill him. If it was me facing the iron spear, I would probably condense my sword style into an iron chain and try to bind the spear. But I don't understand how Ninkei could avoid his spear. Eldest brother thought for a while and shook his head, saying, I also don't know how youngest brother did it. Yisu closed his eyes and listened attentively to the faint sound of the spear and the knife clashing on the distant snow lake. He suddenly thought of a possibility. After a while, he opened his eyes and said with a frown, even so, it can't be explained. Eldest brother asked, is that so? Yisu said expressionlessly, you know what I mean. Eldest brother said, the academy will not admit it. Yisu said coldly, not admitting it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Eldest brother said slowly, if there is no evidence, it will only cause trouble. Yisu took a deep breath and suddenly said something that made no sense. The headmaster of the academy will leave one day. Eldest senior brother said without hesitation. This was almost the same as what Ninkei had said to Yi Hongyu. I don't think the headmaster will leave before us. After inheriting youngest uncle's mantle in the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, the Great Spirit had been constantly changing Ninkei's body. His body was becoming stronger and stronger, and his power was increasing. Correspondingly, his body movements and speed were also becoming faster and faster. But Xiahou was a powerhouse of the previous generation of the Devil's Doctrine. His body had been nourished by the genuine qi for many years, so both his power and speed were far above Ninkei's. That was why he could block Xiahou's open spear. Ninkei did not know that Xiahou's last move was actually a Taoist skill, nor did he expect that Xiahou would have his own natal item. But deep in his sense of perception, there were countless fragments of consciousness that Master Lotus had transferred to him. Those fragments of consciousness were the spiritual brand. Xiahou's Devil's Doctrine skills were all inherited from Lotus. Lotus knew his disciple better than anyone else. Although he could not know the situation when Xiahou cultivated the open spear, he knew Xiahou's temperament, preferences, habits, and even the position of his feet. He knew everything about Xiahou. If Master Lotus was said to be a huge net that was as wide as the ocean, then Xiahou would be the stone giant walking on this huge net. He looked strong and indestructible, but in actual fact every step he took was still within the net. Every tremor would let the net know his intentions. Xiahou had all the spiritual brands of Master Lotus, which meant that he had the net. Although he could not actively control these spiritual brands, when Xiahou walked on the net, the fragments of consciousness in the depth of his sense of perception would start to shine, telling him in advance what Xiahou was going to do and what he should do. Last year at the Hulun Sea in the cold winter, Ninkei, who was not as strong as he was now, could still remain calm when facing Xiahou's fist that was more powerful than tonight. This was because of the effect of the fragments of consciousness. Tonight, these fragments of consciousness were still working. A cold wind blew from the winter forest on the east side of the lake, rolling up the snow on the lake and sprinkling it. Xiahou looked at the snow and suddenly thought of the snow-like ashes in his hands at the Hulun Sea. That box of his teacher's ashes. His body suddenly became cold. Teacher, what did he teach you? Xiahou looked at Ninkei and asked. His eyes were burning with cold flames. Ninkei's eyes were also very bright. He pointed to his head and said, Master Lotus did not teach me anything, but he did leave something for me. The consciousness that he left told me that he also wanted to kill you, the evil disciple, to clean up the Enlightenment doctrine. So these are all your teacher's murderous intentions towards you. Xiahou was silent for a long time. Suddenly, he said indifferently, the academy claims to be on the right path. You are a disciple of the academy, but your teacher is Lotus and you use the Devil's Doctrine skills. You are really rebellious. Ninkei said, you are a disciple of the Devil's Doctrine and your teacher is Lotus. But you betrayed the Devil's Doctrine and joined Haotian Taoism. You even changed to Haotian Taoism skills and abandoned your own heaven and earth to cultivate natal items. You are even more rebellious than me. Xiahou suddenly sneered and said, I did not expect that tonight would be a battle between two traitors. Ninkei shook his head and said, The devil's doctrine sees you as an enemy. The academy did not deny my identity. Xiahou said, no matter what teacher taught you, you will still die tonight. Ningke said, I thought that I was the only one in the world who was better at talking than fighting. Xiahou squinted and said, then let's do it. Please take another spear from me. The cold voice gradually faded away. Xiahou's burly body seemed to become a real mountain. A deep crack suddenly appeared on the solid lake ice under his feet, and the lake water could be faintly seen. The snow lake finally began to ripple. The distance between the two people on the surface of the lake shrank rapidly. Xiahou held the iron spear and stabbed it straight. Ningke shook his wrist and chopped down with his padao. The iron spear and the padao met again. Ningke frowned as he felt the terrifying power coming from the hilt of the padao. Without any hesitation, he released his psyche power and the drop of crystal liquid in his body began to spin at a high speed. The great spirit that he had cultivated in the cliff cave at the back of the academy for several months spurted out in an almost presumptuous manner. The padao in his hand suddenly shone brightly. Countless golden rays of light splashed out from the dark blade, like the golden light reflected by the city wall of Chang, and at dusk. It was also like the sudden appearance of the sun. In an instant, the dark Yinming Lake was as bright as day. After the golden and holy light left the padao, it passed through the cold air and turned into a golden sand-like object, hitting Xiahou's face hard. For thousands of years, Taoism and the devil's doctrine had always been at odds. The West Hill Divine Palace's divine skill was undoubtedly one of the nemeses of the devil's doctrine. After Yi Hongyu understood the divine skill, she was seen as the natural successor of the judicial department, who was responsible for hunting down the remnants of the devil's doctrine. The powerhouses of the devil's doctrine were most afraid of the holy Haoyin divine light. Even the youngest uncle of the academy had used the divine light to imprison people like Master Lotus. The divine skill was a gift from Haoyin to Haoyin Taoism. It was also a punishment for the devil's doctrine. Those golden rays ignored the strong bodies and vigorous qi of the devil's doctrine cultivators and directly affected the flow of qi in their bodies. They could even directly melt the crystal walls of their meridians. In the Battle of the Winter Lake tonight, Xiahou had saved his most powerful move for last. He swept his iron spear in all directions, and Ningke had also saved his Taoism divine skill for this moment. In the blazing Haoyin divine light, Xiahou's cheeks seemed to be so pale that they were about to become transparent. His eyes seemed to be really burning. His eyelashes fell off one by one in the divine light, then turned into charcoal, then into ashes, and finally into nothingness. A touch of fear flashed through his eyes, followed by a mocking smile. Looking at Ningke outside the divine light, Xiahou laughed wildly and almost roared. You think I don't know that you know the divine skill? But your divine skill is fake. This is still the Great Spirit. How can candlelight turn into sunlight? Fake is fake, it will never become real. You are not Kohaoren, what can you do to me? An extremely vigorous zhenqi gushed out from his body, which was as tall and sturdy as a mountain. With a hissing sound, the surrounding snow was shaken off the surface of the lake and floated into the night sky. Xiahou stood in the floating snow, holding the spear with one hand and pressing it down. He was like a god looking down from above the clouds, unstoppable. Ningke's knees were slightly bent and his face was pale. The ice under his feet made a creaking sound, as if it was about to break. Xiahou turned his right palm over and hit Ningke's head like a small mountain. He said with an indifferent expression, "Die." Xiahou was seriously injured tonight, and his strength was less than 20 to 30% of his peak. But he was a powerhouse at the peak of martial arts after all. Even with this remaining strength, he was still extremely powerful. With Ningke's current strength, it was already an extremely shocking scene to be able to withstand Xiahou's spear in the open. His entire mind and all the Great Spirit were focused on the padao, and he had no spare energy to deal with the palm that was like a small mountain hitting his head. Even if he did, it would be too late. However, at this moment, Xiahou let out an extremely shrill scream, retracted his palm and retreated quickly. Blood spurted out from his lower abdomen. He split the ice and snow along the way and retreated 2,000 feet in a flash. The blood that spurted out dragged a long line of blood on the snow lake. Just at that moment, Ningke retracted his knife in an extremely unreasonable manner. At that time, Xiaoho's palm was only half a foot away from his head. At that time, the iron spear in Xiaoho's hand was no longer blocked by the padao and was about to go down. He stabbed his knife deep into Xiaoho's lower abdomen. When he pulled out his knife, Xiaoho's palm was still half a foot away from his head. The iron spear in Xiaoho's hand did not move at all, as if it was suspended in the air. Ningke retracted his knife and once again blocked in front of the iron spear. Only then did Xiaoho react. So he retracted his palm and retreated quickly. He retreated across half of the snow lake. Even lightning could not describe the speed of Ningke's knife. It was a kind of momentum that surpassed the sense of speed. It was like a torrential turbid wave falling from the sky. The speed was not necessarily fast, but the momentum made everyone who saw it feel that they could not stop it from happening. On the snow lake in the distance, Xiaoho covered his bleeding abdomen and asked in shock and anger, "What knife is this?" Ningke looked at him and said, "You know that I know divine skills, but do you know that I know swordsmanship?" What he used previously was not knife skills but sword style. It was the sword style of the world's most powerful sage of sword, Liu Bai. On the cold city wall, Yisu looked in the direction of Yanming Lake and felt the unfamiliar but sharp sword style that he would never mistake. He subconsciously scattered the snow on the wall in front of him and said in disbelief, "A turbid river falling from the sky. How could it be Liu Bai's sword style?" He suddenly turned around and looked at eldest brother in shock. He said, "Ningke already knows enough things. He actually learned Liu Bai's sword. Who taught him? Could it be the academy?" Eldest brother answered honestly, "Although youngest brother has learned Haoran's sword, the day sword was not taught by the academy." Yisu frowned and asked, "Then who taught him?" Eldest brother hesitated for a moment and said, "Your sister. I worked very hard to write it here. See you all tomorrow." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 484. Ningke suddenly turned around. He held the hilt in his right hand and the other end of the blade in his left hand. He stood in front of him with the Great Spirit Sword, trying to block Xiaoho's spear. There was a crisp crack. Ningke's left wrist was broken, and the back of the blade fell heavily on his shoulder. He shouldered it again. Xiaoho's iron spear moved forward again. There was another crisp cracking sound. There was a sharp pain in Ningke's left shoulder, and he could no longer withstand the huge force coming from the blade. He knelt on one knee, and his knee smashed several cracks on the hard ice. His face suddenly turned pale. He was in great pain, so his face was very, very white. But for some reason there was no shadow of death in his eyes. Instead, they were very, very bright. With a cry of pain like that of a wild beast, Ningke turned the pain into an unimaginable instantaneous strength. He forcefully turned his right wrist, clenched his injured left hand into a fist, and hit the back of the blade heavily. Just these two simple movements made the heavy padao in his hand seem to have gained some sort of life in an instant. Like a nimble snake, it rolled up along Xiaoho's iron spear, creating a series of knife sparks. Instead, it pushed Xiaoho's iron spear downwards. The drop of crystal liquid condensed from the Great Spirit Qi in his abdomen suddenly exploded. That drop of liquid evaporated instantly and turned into nothingness. Those wisps of steam flowed along his meridians and poured into every part of his body. All the Great Spirit in his body burst out in the shortest time possible. The blazing Haotian's divine light once again spurted out from the blade, making his figure seem even more burly and insufferably arrogant than Xiaoho, who was in front of the blade. The divine light shone on Xiaoho's thin and strange face, illuminating his eyes, and even the trace of indifference and mockery in his eyes was clearly illuminated. Xiaoho knew that this was Ningke's desperate attack. But he was not afraid. Just as he had said before, Ningke was not Ku Haoran. No matter how his great spirit imitated Haotian's divine light, it could not be the real Haotian's divine light. He stared at Ningke's pale cheeks and shouted coldly, "Liu Bai's sword style is not Liu Bai's sword after all. No matter how many things you know, they are still other things." The shout reverberated on the cold snow lake. shaking the divine light on Ninkei's blade like a torch in the wind. The iron spear suddenly rose a few inches, and the padao retreated a few inches. "You can't stab me again and you can't hurt me again." Xiahou stared into Ninkei's eyes and said coldly and disdainfully, "As a disciple of the academy, you actually joined the devil and refused to cultivate your natal item. You don't even know what your heart is, so what's the point of not dying?" With that said, the divine light on the blade shook even more violently. It was like a candle in the wind, about to be extinguished at any moment. Ninkei's face was pale, and he spat out a mouthful of blood into the divine flame. The blood turned into steam with a sizzling sound, but his eyes were still so calm. Then he said two words that no one had expected. "Thank you." Ninkei was very clear about how powerful Xiahou was, and how difficult it was for him, who was in the see-through state, to complete a challenge that was rarely seen in the world. So he had made a lot of plans. These plans spanned a period of 15 years, and were finally finalized when he left the House of Red Sleeves during the day, and smelled the mutton soup in the streets of Chang'an. These plans were aimed at Xiahou's powerful strength and the hidden tricks this powerhouse might have, and then tried to find a chance to kill him. In tonight's battle on the Snow Lake, some of these plans played an important role, such as the storm of talismans, the iron arrows and the iron kettles. But some were useless. For example, when he fell from the night sky it looked miserable, but actually he wanted to lure Xiahou into the dark and cold lake bottom to kill him. According to the information provided by Zhu'er years ago, Xiahou was very afraid of water. But the actual situation was that Xiahou became more and more powerful and terrifying at the bottom of the lake. Ninkei did not find a chance to use some of the plans in the battle, and some of the plans were only half used. From the very beginning he had been looking for a chance to fight with Xiahou and compete with his genuine qi, because he knew the threat of Haoyan's divine light to the powerhouses of the devil's doctrine through Yihangyu. He found two opportunities and he was faced with two choices. When Haoyan's divine light spurted out from the padao for the first time, he chose to use the Great Spirit to cooperate with Liu Bai's sword style. According to his calculation, the Great Spirit inherited from youngest uncle and Liu Bai's sword style that he had recently comprehended were his most powerful skills. In fact, he did successfully injure Xiahou, but it was a pity that he could not kill him. Now that he was faced with a second chance, he was not sure what he should choose. Until he heard Xiahou's cold and condescending scolding, he finally made up his mind. After using the secret method of the devil's doctrine, Xiahou became extremely skinny. His eyes were sunken, and his cheeks seemed to be covered with a thin layer of skin. The bones underneath could be seen clearly, and he actually looked a little like his teacher Lotus at the front gate of the devil's doctrine. Under the blazing light, he looked even more like a god or a devil. Xiahou did not hesitate to burn his life and flesh, and severely deplete his lifespan, to completely change the situation of the battle at the Snow Lake. In front of the powerful Xiahou, Ninkei did not have the slightest ability to fight back. The Haoyan's divine light created by the Great Spirit could cause a certain amount of damage to him, but it could not change the overall situation of the battle. Ninkei saw that he was about to die, but at this moment he said thank you. This thank you was so baffling. Xiahou did not know if Ninkei had really gone crazy before he was about to die, and he could not understand why Ninkei would thank him. However, he felt that there was something strange in this thank you and he felt a little uneasy. Ninkei looked at Xiahou's hideous and scary skinny cheeks on the other side of the blazing light, and said with mixed emotions, "I also have a natal item. Do you want to see what it is?" As he said this, an extremely condensed psyche power was released from Ninkei's body. The psyche power left the mottled blood color on his body, and floated above the Snow Lake. The adjective to describe the psyche power as floating did not mean that the psyche power was moving slowly, but the feeling it gave people was that the psyche power was extremely pure. However, it was like an ignorant child with brute force. In the chi of heaven and earth that permeated above the Snow Lake, it did not know where to touch. In the daytime, in front of the Wind and Snow Palace, Xiahou had once evaluated Ninkei's psyche power. He said that Ninkei's psyche power was vigorous and pure, but his control of the chi of heaven and earth was extremely bad. This was the situation now. However, Xiahou's eyes suddenly turned cold, because he could clearly feel that the psyche power released by Ninkei had captured an extremely thin wisp of chi of heaven and earth on the snow lake. That wisp of chi of heaven and earth reached the cliff of the lake in an instant. Just as it landed on the edge of the cliff, that extremely thin wisp of chi of heaven and earth instantly stabilized and began to expand at an extremely terrifying speed. It was as if there was something on the cliff that was continuously pouring into this wisp of chi of heaven and earth. Holding the hilt tightly with both hands, Ninkei's face was pale, but his eyes were bright. Risking the risk of destroying his cultivation, he dispersed the crystal-clear liquid in his abdomen with a thought and sent all the Great Spirit out at the same time to ensure that it could suppress Xiaoho's iron spear for a period of time. He had to cherish this period of time. His psyche power released from his sense of perception, passed through the extremely stagnant snow mountain and ocean of chi that only had 10 apertures open, and passed through the difficult invisible chi apertures. Finally, it converged into a very weak and clumsy little song. He hoped that this little song could be heard and understood, because he was using this song to call his natal item. Cultivators did not rely on the chi of heaven and earth to directly affect the things in the world. Instead, they used the chi of heaven and earth as a bridge to transmit their psyche power to the object, thereby triggering the vibration of the chi of heaven and earth inside the object. The object that was most harmonious with the cultivator's psyche power, and most likely to resonate, was the natal item. This was what Shin Pippi said. He believed that it was very difficult for a cultivator to find a natal item that was completely compatible with his aura. That night in the old library, he spoke to Ninkei with fervor and assurance. Using music as an example, the so-called natal item was the object that could understand and listen to his song very much. It was also the so-called bosom friend. The natal item of a swordmaster was the natal sword, such as Liu Bai's day sword. Of course, as the strongest sage of sword in the world, he could now draw his natal sword on paper. The natal item of a talisman master was the natal talisman, such as Master Yen Sei's Jing Fu. This talisman was the closest to him, and until the moment before his death, they were still fighting side by side. Ninkei was a rare dual cultivator. His natal item was not a knife, not a sword, not a natal talisman, not a writing brush, ink, paper, inkstone, mountains, rivers, trees, or even his most beloved silver. His natal item was a little handmaiden. It was the little handmaiden with yellow hair and a slightly tanned face. On the snow lake, Ninkei's psyche power controlled the chi of heaven and earth and came to Yinming Mountain. The little song was played silently by the cliff. Chun Pippi once said that his song was very unpleasant and difficult to understand. Moreover, it was relatively far to night, so the song was unusually dim and ethereal. It was not a tune at all. Zhang Sang felt the psyche power. She heard the song and also understood it. Although there was no real music playing on Yinming Mountain, she could clearly hear a mountain song. It was a song that Ninkei liked to hum many years ago when he carried her on his back climbing in the depths of Min Mountain. Ninkei's acupoints were blocked and his 5 tones were not complete. The reason why he was not afraid of losing face and often hummed this song to Sang Sang was because Sang Sang liked to listen to him sing this song when she could not sleep. This song was Song Song's lullaby. Sang Sang held the big black umbrella and stood by the cliff with a slightly lost expression. She looked at the light in the snow lake under the cliff and did not quite understand what had happened. But she understood the call or invitation that Ninkei made in the psyche power. Ninkei was inviting her to build the closest connection, which was absolute obedience. Even the shadow of death and the threat of Yama could not tear apart the connection. Any life with self-consciousness would instinctively resist such an absolute one-sided connection. Even if they finally accepted it, they would need a long time to struggle. But Sang Sang did not hesitate or struggle and agreed to the invitation. Because she had always been his little handmaiden. Please calm down. Although I am indeed a little hot at this time, I continue to write. There is one more chapter. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 485. Song Song's right hand was in the cold night wind. A ray of light appeared on her index finger. The light suddenly became round and turned into a weak flame. The color of the flame was unusually white, without any impurities. It gave off a sense of holiness. Immediately after, her thumb, middle finger, ring finger, and little finger also produced this kind of holy flame at the same time, illuminating her slightly black little hand to make it abnormally white. These holy flames were Haoyin's divine light. The Haoyin's divine light between her fingers was blown by the night wind. More holy flames seeped out from the gaps of her new clothes, from her dark little face, and from the ends of her yellowish hair, covering her thin body. The big black umbrella in her left hand seemed to have sensed something. It slowly closed without any wind and silently leaned against her leg. The cliff of Yanming Lake shone brightly. Sangsang shone brightly. It seemed that endless Haoyin's divine light gushed out from her thin body. In an instant it illuminated the snow-covered cliff in front of her, the messy snow lake under the cliff, the broken wells and dilapidated walls on the other side of the lake, the snow bridge and reeds on the west bank, the winter woods and snow monks on the east bank, and the entire Chang'an city. The holy and blazing light shot from the Yanming Lake to the sky and spread to every corner of Chang'an city. The deep night seemed to usher in a solemn sunrise, which was as bright as day. On the cliff of Yanming Lake, the Haoyin's divine light around Songsong's body seemed to have no temperature, because her hair was not curled and her clothes were not burnt. However, the burning flame seemed to be really burning. The blood stains on her clothes were burned away without a trace. The mud and dirty snow on her shoes also turned into smoke and dissipated. All the filth was purified, and she became more transparent than clean. She was as transparent as herself. One day in the 14th year of the Tianqi era, the old man who escaped from the West Hill Divine Palace came to Chang'an. He bought a bowl of hot and sour noodle slice soup and spilled half of it, dirtying his cotton-padded jacket. He saw a dark and thin girl in the old brush pen shop on Lin 47th Street and was unwilling to leave again. The old man looked at her and followed her. He told her that the path of destiny was bright, and taught her everything he had learned in his life without holding anything back. He said with great emotion, "I have never seen an existence more transparent than you." Therefore Sangsang was transparent. Therefore, the Haoyin divine flame that was emitted from her body was not damaged or refracted. It was as pure and holy as the original divine flame. Some people in the West Hill Divine Palace who were dedicated to Taoism had also mastered Songsong's divine skill. For example, Yi Hongyu the Tao addict was good at it. However, no one in Haoyin Taoism could produce purer Songsong's divine flame than Sangsang, because she was a descendant of light. She was the daughter of light. Under the white light, the reeds by the bridge on the west bank seemed to have become beautiful objects carved from white jade. Yi Hongyu held the railing tightly and looked at the dazzling light on the lake in the distance. She was shocked speechless. She knew that Sangsang knew divine skills, and she had discussed it with the little handmaiden. However, she never knew that Songsong's divine skills were so strong. It should have been late at night, and they could not borrow the light of Haotian. She could not understand how Sangsang could release so much light. Although she knew that she was the only descendant of the divine priest of light in the world, and the person whom the West Hill Divine Palace wanted to invite back to Peach Mountain, she still could not understand. No one could understand the light by the Yanming Lake, including Yisu, who was standing on the city wall. However, he did not try to understand the scene in front of him like his sister. Looking at the divine flame that illuminated the night sky and feeling the aura there, the face of the descendant of Jishou Abbey was full of piety, longing, shock, and confusion. He murmured, "What a pure light!" Eldest brother, who was standing beside Yisu, also looked in the direction of Yanming Lake. He did not change his expression, nor did he smile. Instead, he looked very serious. No one knew what he was worried about. Under the snow bridge outside the military camp, the soldiers of the Yulin Royal Guards and the cultivators of the Imperial Center Administration looked in the direction of Yanming Lake in shock. The light shone on their faces clearly. Su Shi looked up at the beautiful light reflected by the dark clouds in the night sky. His movement seemed particularly heavy, and his wrinkled face was full of questions. Second brother, who was sitting cross-legged on the snow bridge, had his head lowered most of the time from day to night. At this time he finally raised his head and looked at the light of Yanming Lake. He showed a rare sincere smile. Then he looked at Su Shi and said, "This is a miracle." Although this was not a miracle created by the Academy, A miracle was a miracle. After Master Yen Sei and the great divine priest of light died together, second brother climbed the nameless mountain and saw the little handmaiden holding the ashes of the ashes. He felt pity for her and somehow felt that a miracle would happen to the little handmaiden in the future. For this, he did not hesitate to argue with eldest brother, whom he respected the most. Tonight he finally saw a miracle happen to Sang Sang, so he began to smile. In the winter forest on the east bank of Yanming Lake, Qin Yin's body was covered with thousands of snowflakes like cicada wings. He looked like a statue of Buddha carved from ice and snow. No matter how fierce the battle on the snow lake was, the wayfarer of Buddhism sect remained silent. He put his palms together to guard his heart against the person behind the sound of cicadas, and waited for the result calmly. When Haotian's divine light appeared on the cliff, he suddenly opened his eyes. Thin snowflakes fell from his eyes. There were many complicated emotions in his gentle but firm eyes. Those emotions were compassionate, peaceful, struggling, and finally, they turned into admiration. The faint sound of cicadas in the winter forest also changed at this time. The rhythm of the cicadas strangely showed indifference and disgust, but the tone seemed to be satisfied. In the pavilion outside the snow hall of the imperial palace, Li Qingshan, the nation master of Tang, looked at the light that suddenly lit up the night sky in the south. His right hand that was stroking his beard suddenly trembled and pulled out several long strands of beard. Master Huang Yang, who was standing beside the snow bell, looked in the direction of Yanming Lake. He opened his mouth slightly and his sigh turned into a compassionate Buddhist chant. His palm seemed to unconsciously pat the surface of the bell. The thin snowflakes on the ancient bell cracked inch by inch and slid down the surface of the bell to the ground. The melodious and solemn bell sound spread far away in the daytime night. The world in Song Song's eyes was white at this time. Pure and flawless white. That was the color of light. Her eyes did not stay on the world of pure divine light. Instead, she silently looked at the back of the figure on the snow lake, and felt the message transmitted by the psyche power. The psyche power was desperately summoning. It seemed so greedy and hungry, even with a hint of panic. It was like a devil that wanted to devour her flesh and blood. Sang Sang clearly felt this meaning, but she did not panic. In the burning Haotian divine light, she calmly opened her spiritual world and opened it to Ning Ke, who was on the other side of the psyche power. Some consciousness had long become Song Song's instinct. Her spirit, her flesh and blood, her divine light, her life, her everything belonged to her in Ning Quebec. She could share it with him without hesitation or offer it to him. In this case, why should she be afraid? Why should she panic? She was Ning Ke's natal, and Ning Ke was also her natal. Then she would give him as much as he wanted, even if it was all she had. Whatever he wanted she would give him, even if it was life. If the relationship between a cultivator and his natal was intimate, then Ning Ke and Sang Sang were the best in the world. They were not high mountains and flowing rivers but pots and pans. Their joy, anger, sorrow and joy were interlinked. They did not need to try to understand each other. They were born to understand each other. If the relationship between a cultivator and his natal was intimate, then Ning Ke and Sang Sang were the two closest people in the world. They ate and slept together since they were young. They slept together in the hot summer and shared a coat to keep warm in the cold winter. When they raised their eyebrows, Ning Ke knew that you were writing with a branch. When they smiled, Ning Ke knew that you were cutting your hand while washing dishes. If fate really existed, then 15 years ago, Haotian let them meet in the starving Hebei County, and then they began to live and die together. They had lived and died together, and they would live and die together forever. This was fate. It seemed that everything had been predestined. There seemed to be a common way in the unseen world. At this time, the Haotian divine light that Sang Sang burned with her life was going to pass to that person through the unseen channel. The aura between heaven and earth suddenly became quiet. In the light, Song Song's face was pale. She frowned and seemed to be in great pain. But there was a smile on her face. The Haotian divine light that was burning on her suddenly condensed into a beam and shot down the cliff. It formed a light bridge, connecting Yanming Mountain and Yanming Lake. Endless Haotian divine light passed through the light bridge and passed through the cold wind on the snow lake. It continuously entered Ning Ke's body, and made the padao that he was holding shine brightly. The Haotian divine light that hit his face made Xiaoho's pupils suddenly shrink. However, in a very short period of time, his eyes gradually turned yellow and showed a shocked and frightened expression. He felt that this was not the Haotian divine light that was simulated by the Great Spirit, but the real Haotian divine light. It was the kind of power that he was most afraid of. Although he had long betrayed the devil's doctrine and turned to Haotian Taoism, he was still afraid. Countless Haotian divine light spat out from the padao and shrouded Xiaoho's body. These flames that were supposed to be solemn and compassionate seemed so cruel at this moment, mercilessly burning his body and spirit. These flames of divine light were equivalent to Ninkei's own divine light at this moment, so he was not affected at all. His padao suddenly became sharp, and with dazzling flames he chopped forward. This was the most familiar and simplest padao that he was most familiar with. There were no fancy moves, and it only chopped from top to bottom, but it was also his most powerful one. At the Shubi Lake, he had chopped off the heads of countless horse gang members. At the side gate of the academy, he had chopped Lu Yiqing into a piece of trash. The iron spear in Xiaoho's hand could no longer withstand the power of the Great Spirit on the padao, and the burning and purification of Haotian divine light. With a crisp sound, it was broken into two. The edge of the blade continued to move downwards. Xiaoho's roar was like thunder exploding on the snow lake. His pair of iron hands struck forward with the momentum of a bridge and forcibly clamped Ninkei's padao between his fists. The huge impact of Xiaoho's fists passed along the padao to the hilt and then to Ninkei's body. But Ninkei seemed to not feel it at all. He lowered his head and pursed his lips, and continued to press down without a word. The blade that was spitting Haotian divine light burned Xiaoho's fists. It moved down slowly and unstoppably, getting closer and closer to his thin and pale face. In the face of impending death, Xiaoho let out a crazy howl and made a last effort to lift his badly injured foot and kick at Ninkei's waist and abdomen. Even if Xiaoho kicked Ninkei, he could no longer block Ninkei's padao and the Haotian divine light on it. But he still did it because he wanted Ninkei to die with him. However, he could not even die with Ning Quebec. At the moment when the tip of his foot kicked Xiaoho's waist, an aura passed along his leg to Xiaoho's body and entered his sense of perception. Finally, it turned into an extremely thick smell of blood in his mouth and nose. Xiaoho was very familiar with the aura, because he had felt it before. He was also very unfamiliar with the aura, because he had not felt it for many years. That aura that had transformed into a thick stench of blood was so cold, yet so vast, as if it was standing in the distant sky and looking down at him from above. Then Xiaoho heard the sound of cicadas. The cicadas that he heard in the palace during the day. He thought it was an auditory hallucination. The cicadas that he heard when he stepped into the Yanming Lake at dusk seemed both real and illusory. At this time before he died, he heard the cicadas again, and this time he was sure it was real. Ninkei was kicked away and fell heavily on the snow. He struggled to prop up his body and wanted to get up to give Xiaoho another stab. But no matter how hard he struggled, it was futile. He could only sit in the snow, panting. There was a cut on Xiaoho's body. The cut was very straight, starting from his forehead and extending downwards, cutting open his nose, lips, chest, and abdomen. Blood oozed out from the cut. Tonight's battle was too fierce, and he had lost too much blood. At this time, the remaining blood in his body could only ooze out, making him look even more miserable. Xiaoho did not fall down. He looked down at the deep wound on his chest. This cut might not have been fatal to him when he was at his peak, but it was not something he could bear at this time. For some reason, the Haotian divine light around him did not extinguish, but continued to burn. The cold lake water seemed to have turned into lamp oil, and the snow seemed to have turned into coal. The entire Yanming Lake seemed to be burning, emitting a dazzling light that illuminated everything on the lake clearly. Under the illumination of the divine light, Xiaoho looked at the cut on his chest and knew that death was coming. He slowly let go of his hand, letting the two halves of the spear fall, smashing into the snowflakes. The bell that rang from the palace in the distance finally came to Yanming Lake. Xiaoho looked up at the source of the bell, not knowing if he was thinking of his sister. The bell rang again. There was a buzzing sound in his mountain-like body, and countless fine gravel splashed out from his body and scattered around, as if it was the dust he had hidden for decades. The melodious bell rang continuously, echoing in the quiet Chang'an city. Puff, puff, puff. Xiaoho's body made a series of muffled sounds, and the surface of his body suddenly sunk. Some parts of his body bulged, and his broken bones and flesh looked like they had been punched by someone. These were all Tang's fists. In the successive assassinations in the wilderness, Tang risked his life and serious injuries to use the blood knife to break Xiaoho's armor, leaving more than a dozen fists on his body. In the past few days, Xiaoho used his powerful genuine qi and terrifying state to forcibly suppress these fists' injuries. At this time, the Haotian divine light had melted the meridian crystal wall in his body, so he could not suppress these fists' wills, and they instantly erupted. The injuries that he had previously suppressed with the secret method of the devil's doctrine also erupted again. Countless wounds reappeared on his skin, and the scene looked extremely strange. Before death, he had to relive the injuries that he had suffered before and bear the pain again. It had to be said that this was a very cruel thing. Xiaoho's internal organs were all broken, and it could even be said that they had become rotten things. There was not much blood in his muscles, but there was still a lot of blood in his internal organs, so Xiaoho began to cough blood. The thick black blood flowed along his esophagus and trachea into his mouth, and then overflowed his lips. Xiaoho stood in the snow, coughing blood and laughing. Ningke sat in the snow and was silent for a long time. Then he also laughed. The smiles of the two of them had completely different meanings. On the edge of the cliff of Yanming Mountain, Sang Sang sat in the snow, looking extremely weak. She looked at the scene on the lake in the distance and knew that Ningke did not want to laugh at this time, but he definitely wanted to cry. Thinking of this, her heart ached and she began to cry. Cold tears continuously flowed down her slightly dark face, but they could not wash away the smile that gradually appeared on her face. This was really something to be happy about, so she softly hummed, "We are from the mountains and rivers, and we want to take your life. We are from the riverside, and we want to take your life. We are from the grassland, and we want to take your life. We are from an uninhabited small village in the Yin territory, and we want to take your life. We are from the uninhabited general's mansion in Chang'an City, and we want to take your life." The lyrics of this song were the clumsy revenge poem that she had written for Ning Quebec. The tune was the lullaby that Ning Ke often sang to her when she was young. Song Song's voice was very soft and a little childish. It was not pleasant to hear. But at this time, the song that came from the cliff was so moving, and it was melodious on the lake in winter. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 486. People were about to die. The night was still cold before dawn. However, the snow lake was extremely bright. Haotian's divine flame continued to burn on the ice surface and in the lake water, releasing clouds of water vapor. One could faintly hear the sound of boiling, like a hot spring in the morning. Xiaoho was covered in blood. His scattered white hair was stuck to the shape of a withered willow. He looked at Ning Ke with his dim eyes full of deep confusion. He said in a hoarse voice, "You were only 4 years old at that time. Hatred is not easy for a 4-year-old to remember. Do you really hate me so much?" The cold wind blew on his face. The smile on Ning Ke's face gradually disappeared. He said a few words. "The 4 years in Chang, and when I was a child were the happiest days of my previous life and this life. At that time I didn't need to think or learn anything. I only needed to enjoy the love of my parents, play with my playmates, and secretly read the books of the general. Unfortunately, those days were destroyed by you. In the eyes of others, I lived a good life these years. But only I know how painful and unhappy it is to struggle to live every day. So of course I hate you. No matter what I've done over the years, the housekeeper and the young master who I killed in the woodshed will never come back to life. The people who died in the general's mansion will never come back to life. My parents will never come back to life. My best days will never come back to me. So no one or anything can stop me from killing you. I want them to know that it's worthwhile for me to wield that knife. I also want you to know that I'm avenging my parents. My father's name is Lin Tao, and my mother's name is Li Sanyang. Xiaohou looked down at the knife wound on his chest and abdomen. He suddenly asked, how does it feel to have your revenge? Ningke said, it feels good. Xiaohou raised his head and felt a little confused. He said, how does it feel? I don't know what kind of feeling it is. Anyway, I feel very relaxed. I always feel that the world has become different after your death. I am no longer the same person I was in the past 15 years. Ningke thought for a while and said, I understand why I feel relaxed. Because after your death, I can have more time to write calligraphy to earn money, instead of writing many boring talismans every night. After your death, I can often go to the House of Red Sleeves to listen to music, instead of listening to senior brother's music at the back of the mountain of the academy. After you die, I will still cultivate, but I won't be doing it to make myself stronger like I did in the past years. I will do it purely for my interests and hobbies, or to satisfy my desire to seek Tao. After you die, I won't have to stare at your back and wait for the battle in the city of Wei or Chang, and like I used to. I can go to the great river of the South Jin Kingdom, to the East Sea of the Divine Hall, and to see the world and the people living in it. He looked at Xiaohou and said very seriously, after you die, I won't have to think about killing you anymore. Only then can I obtain true freedom and do what I want to do. Xiaohou laughed. His laughter was very sad, and his expression was very strange. Freedom? Xiaohou looked at Ningke with eyes full of pity and mockery. He said, as a disciple of the orthodox faction, you have been deeply involved in the devil's doctrine, just like how I betrayed the devil's doctrine. You have already followed my old path, and are destined to struggle for survival in the gap between light and darkness. How can you obtain true freedom, and naturally you won't have any happiness? Ningke used the padao as a crutch, supported his weak body, and stood up with difficulty. He looked at Xiaohou and said, the academy is not the enlightenment doctrine, and I am not you. Those who did not have a deep understanding of the academy could not understand the true attitude of the academy, especially the headmaster of the academy towards the devil's doctrine. Ningke never worried that he would become the hero in the story. The academy is indeed not the enlightenment doctrine. With the headmaster of the academy's breadth of mind, he would not care about what his disciple cultivates. But you are indeed not me. You are simply not a human. The light in Xiaohou's eyes, which had been dim like a firefly that could be killed by the cold wind at any time, became bright at this moment. He said sternly, you are the son of Yama. 15 years ago, the divine priest of light thought that the son of Yama had been born in the Xianwei general's mansion, and the West Hill Divine Palace had instructed Xiaohou to carry out a purge. That was why there were so many stories in tonight's bloody battle. Before Xiaohou died, he recalled the doubts of tonight's battle. Those who were not there but had arrived through Ningke became more and more convinced of this judgment. He looked at Ningke and smiled strangely. He cursed with resentment, Haotian above, you the son of Yama, will one day be burned to ashes by Haotian's divine light, just like me. I am the son of Yama, which probably makes it easier for you to accept the fact that you will die in my hands. But unfortunately, I have nothing to do with Yama. Ningke said, and each of us will die eventually, and we will all be burned to ashes by Haotian's divine light. So your curse means nothing to me. You are really not the son of Yama? Xiaohou murmured, if you are not the son of Yama, how could you escape from Chang, and at such a young age? If you are not the son of Yama, how could you surpass the state and defeat me? How could I die today? His cheeks were as wrinkled as a willow tree that had been split open by lightning, full of confusion and unwillingness. If Ningke was not the son of Yama, how could he have such great luck and such an incredible lucky chance that allowed him to cross states to challenge and kill the powerful Ningke? General Xiaohou, who had been arrogant and tyrannical for decades, looked like an old man spitting saliva at the village entrance looking for the thief who had kicked open the widow's door last night before he died. Then he raised his head, looked at Ningke, and said painfully, I don't want to die. Ningke said, I want you to die. No one wanted to die. Most people died unnaturally because other people in the world wanted them to die. Xiaohou did not want to die. He wanted to live and continue to have glory and power. Ninkei wanted him to die very much. He wanted to dig out his lungs, rack his brains and be heartbroken for 15 years. That was why Xiaohou died. Xiaohou's body, which was still as burly as a mountain, fell straight backward, dispersing the fog-like steam around him. He fell into the lake with a bang, splashing water everywhere. The top layer of the cold lake had been boiled by Haoyin's divine flame and kept rolling. It looked like a hot spring in the valley of the Yin territory, or a big pot of clear soup. Xiaohou's body floated in the boiling lake with his eyes wide open. A trace of doubt and unwillingness could still be seen on his blood-stained face, and the skin on his thin cheeks gradually became strangely red. Many years ago, in the military camp at the foot of Min Mountain, the former saintess of the Devil's Doctrine Murong Linshuang danced the Devil's Dance, which shocked the world. Powerhouses of the West Hill Divine Palace gathered, and sword radiance crisscrossed the mountains and rivers. Xiaohou did not hesitate and cooked her to death, resolutely betraying the Devil's Doctrine and joining Haoyin Taoism. That was the most important turning point in Xiaohou's life. However, he probably did not expect that he would be cooked by the boiling water after his death, just like that woman. If there was a heaven's way, then this was the so-called cycle. Looking at Xiaohou's body bobbing up and down in the boiling lake, Ninkei suddenly said, "Who said that mutton giblets must be eaten on the winter solstice? Who said that you can't stab someone to death without a spearhead?" This was what he said to Yi Hongyu by the mutton giblets pot in autumn. Yi Hongyu understood the first part of the sentence, but did not understand the second part. Today was the winter solstice, and it was the time to eat mutton giblets soup. The snow lake was full of warm and humid water vapor, and standing on the lake was like standing next to a pot of mutton giblets, or like the steam scrubbing room in the courtyard of the House of Red Sleeves. The first person Ninkei killed for revenge, the censor Zhang Yiqi, died in that place. Ninkei felt very warm, very calm, and very relaxed at this time, as if all his pores had relaxed in the steam scrubbing room, and then he ate a big pot of mutton giblets with coriander and fermented bean curd sauce. Who said that the gatekeeper's son can't take revenge? Who said that the see-through state can't cross the state to kill the knowing destiny state? He turned around and walked towards the south bank of Yanming Lake. Occasionally, he raised his arm to wipe his face. It was unknown whether he was wiping away the dust or tears, but his face, especially the corner of his eyes, became very red. Sang Sang had already gone down the cliff and came to the snow lake. Her thin body was already very weak at this time, but she still had to hold the big black umbrella and drag the heavy arrow box, which seemed to be more and more strenuous. Looking at the figure in the sparse snow in front of them, the two quickened their steps at the same time. When they met and looked at each other's familiar face, they had mixed feelings and did not know what to say. So they did not say anything, and Ninkei held Sang Sang in his arms. He hugged her so tightly that their faces were squeezed together, and with tear stains they looked a little funny. Ninkei's face was a little red and hot, and Sang Sang's face was very pale and cold. Their faces were pressed together, and they both felt very comfortable and then calm. By the bridge on the west bank of the lake, Chun Pippi loosened his tightly clenched hand and patted the railing lightly. There was a blood mark on the railing. He had been too worried for Ninkei when he was watching the battle, and he was so nervous that he actually cut his hand. Tang Xiaotang glanced at the green robe on the other side of the bridge, and held Chun Pippi's hand, walked out of the pier, and walked towards the two hugging on the snow lake. Yi Hongyu stood on the wooden bridge and looked in the direction of the snow lake, without any emotion on her face. Then she closed her eyes and her beautiful thin eyebrows slightly furrowed, as if she was thinking about something. In the snow hall of the palace, the empress stood expressionlessly at the threshold. Her gentle face was already covered with tears. The emperor gently hugged her from behind, wanting to give her some comfort. More and more tears flowed from her eyes, and she wanted to break free from his embrace. His Majesty hugged her tightly, and the empress struggled angrily, but in the end she could not break free. This was not because she was too sad, or because she had no strength. She turned around and threw herself into the warm embrace of her husband, crying silently to her heart's content, and the front of her imperial robe was soaked. Under the snow pavilion outside the hall, the nation master Li Qingshan looked in the direction of the Yanming Lake in the south with a complicated expression. Master Huangyang withdrew his palm from the ancient bell, and the bell gradually stopped ringing. The whole Chang'an city was quiet. The whole world was quiet. In the winter forest on the east bank of the Yanming Lake, the cicada suddenly chirped again. The sound was sad, but it was full of joy. There is one more chapter. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 487. The fire on the lake gradually died out, and the chill gradually rose. Tang Xiaotang walked behind Ning Ke and let go of Chan Pippi's hand. Suddenly, she knelt down with a thud, and 2 puffs of snow splashed from her knees. Then she kowtowed heavily. Chan Pippi was slightly shocked. Tang Xiaotang said in a trembling voice, "Thank you, youngest uncle, for cleaning up the Enlightenment doctrine." Ning Ke did not move sideways to avoid it. He calmly accepted the big bow. He was very clear that the devil's doctrine, which had already withered in the world, respected and feared youngest uncle. However, the one they truly hated was Xiahou the traitor. If he did not make Tang Xiaotang kneel, she would not be able to release the complex emotions in her heart. Moreover, Lotus consciousness fragment was in his sense of perception, so he was doing it on behalf of Lotus. But he looked at the quiet night sky of the lake and said, "There are many people by the lake. I'm afraid there will be some trouble if you kneel down." Tang Xiaotang stood up, and Chan Pippi wiped the snow off her forehead. Looking at the red and swollen forehead, he could not help feeling distressed. Hearing Ning Ke's words, he replied, "We are in Chang'an, so there will be no trouble." Today's battle with Xiahou had not been disturbed as he had expected. Of course, Ning Ke was very clear that it must be the academy that played a role in it. Hearing Chan Pippi's words, he could not help but laugh, and his heart was suddenly filled with pride. This was Chang'an, and they were disciples of the academy, so there would be no trouble. But what should he do next? The hatred and killing intent that had accumulated for 15 years were all released as Xiahou's body fell into the lake. Just like the mist that was spewing out from the boiling lake, an ordinary person would probably feel a little empty and perplexed after experiencing great joy and excitement. They would even be at a loss as to what to do. If Ning Ke was still the Ning Ke in the city of Wei, he would probably fall into such a state of mind. After killing Xiahou, it seemed that he had done all that he wanted to do in this life. There was nothing else to do, and he did not even know where to go. But now it was different. He had a home in Chang'an, and it was inconvenient to return to the old brush pen shop on Lin 47th Street. He also had a large house by the Yanming Lake. Although it was already ruined, it was still livable. Besides, there was the academy in the south of Chang'an, and he could always find a hut in the back mountain. "Let's go home first." Holding each other's arms, they walked to the house on the north bank of the lake where the fire had long been extinguished. However, although they were not seriously injured today, they were extremely exhausted and had already reached the point of exhaustion. At this time, when they relaxed their minds, their legs were as heavy as lead, and they almost fell when they took a step. Chan Pippi reacted quickly. He grabbed Ning Ke's arm and scolded him angrily. "Sang Sang has worked so hard tonight. Do you expect her to help you? Will it kill you to beg me?" Ning Ke said, "Don't be too nervous about me. No matter what, Xiahou is a visiting professor of Haotian Taoism. If this gets back to the West Hill or the Jishou Abbey, it won't be good for you. It's not like I want to be a fat Taoist," Chan Pippi said impatiently. Then he grabbed his arm and carried him on his back, walking towards the lake shore. Tang Xiaotang supported Sang Sang and followed behind. From time to time, the sound of snow squeaking could be heard on the quiet lake. The morning light gradually came. Tonight, many people surrounded the lake to watch. They looked at the 2 footprints on the lake, the people in front of the footprints, Ning Ke who was carried by Chan Pippi, and the little handmaiden who was supported by Chan Pippi. They had complicated feelings and always felt that what they saw was not real. Ning Ke, who was at the upper see-through state, killed the overbearing General Xiahou, a powerhouse at the peak state of martial arts with the help of the little handmaiden. In many people's eyes, this was impossible. Even if Ning Ke was a disciple of the headmaster of academy, this was still impossible because this was a fair and square battle. It was not common but not rare for a cultivator at a higher state to die in the hands of an opponent at a lower state. This was because battles had always been unpredictable. Assassination, poison, and traps could sometimes play a decisive role. It was not the first time that a cultivator at the see-through state was killed by an ordinary assassin. However, this rarely happened in a fair and square battle, because it was a competition of absolute strength. Especially for a grand cultivator who had entered the knowing destiny state, it was impossible for a cultivator at a lower state to defeat him in a fair and square battle. The knowing destiny state was a big threshold in cultivation. Once you crossed this threshold, you would be far away from the mortal world. In the records of the cultivation world, other than a powerful army that could use endless cavalry to coordinate with the terrain and exquisite tactics to kill a powerhouse at the knowing destiny state, no one had ever succeeded in challenging a powerhouse at the knowing destiny state. It was said that Ku Hauran had done it, but there was no audience for that battle. People only knew that the powerhouse at the knowing destiny state was dead, and Mr. Ku, who was at the see-through state, continued to ride on the little black donkey. This also meant that the battle between Ning Ke and Xiahou at the Winter Lake was the first time in countless years that someone at the knowing destiny state could kill a powerhouse at the knowing destiny state. This would definitely be recorded in the West Hill scriptures. In this battle, Ning Ke had made a lot of preparations, could even be said to be a trap. However, he was a talisman master, so no one had any doubts about his fighting style. The audience was only shocked by the means that the youngest disciple of the academy had displayed in the battle. Whether it was the storm of the talisman, the primordial 13 arrows, or the mysterious thunder in the lotus field, Ning Ke's skills had an effect that outsiders could not understand. They were so powerful. Although he was still in the see-through state, his skills had the power of the knowing destiny state. Finally, Sang Sang shone brightly at the edge of the cliff, which made everyone fall silent. Tonight there were many spectators in Chang, and who were more powerful than Ning Ke, but they were still greatly shocked, especially Yi Hongyu, who was standing on the wooden bridge on the west bank. She was the most shocked. In today's world, among the three sects of Taoism, Buddhism, and the devil as well as the academy, she had always been the strongest among the younger generation. No matter Prince Longqing, Monk Guanhai, or even Tang Xiaotang, none of them could overshadow her. However, after seeing Ning Ke and Song Song's performance tonight, she suddenly had some other ideas. So she closed her eyes and thought silently. Her eyelashes trembled in the night wind, as if she had understood something through this battle. On the snow-covered city wall, Yisu looked in the direction of the Yanming Lake in the distance. After a long silence, he said, "The academy is indeed powerful, and so is this guy." After watching the battle for a night, Yisu's opinion of Ning Ke kept changing as he watched the thunder, the snow, and the iron arrows, iron lotuses, iron spears, and iron knives colliding with each other continuously. In the beginning, Ning Ke was just an ordinary person in his eyes. Then he became not bad, and finally he became very good. However, when Ning Ke finally succeeded in killing Xiahou, he realized that his opinion was not accurate enough. He did not even want to hide his admiration and appreciation for Ning Quebec. Of course, Ning Ke was no match for him, the successor of the Jishou Abbey. However, he was so young, and yet he managed to kill Xiahou in such an impossible situation. If he studied in the academy for a few more years and received a few more lessons from the headmaster of the academy, who could predict how high Ning Ke would climb in the future? Would there really be another Mr. Ku in the world? Xiahou's death did not affect Yisu's mood at all. Even if there was another Ku Hauran in the academy, it would just be another worthy opponent for him. Instead, it would make him feel gratified. Most importantly, he did not think that Ning Ke would become a second Mr. Ku. He turned to look at eldest brother and said, "Until now, are you still not sure?" Eldest brother asked. "The West Hill Divine Palace said that it was a presumptuous judgment. Why do you insist on it?" "I have said that I believe that the Divine Priest of Light may have made a wrong judgment, but he would never make a presumptuous judgment. Back then, the headmaster might have judged that the son of Lin Guangyun could not be the son of Yama. That was why he thought that the Divine Priest of Light had made a big mistake. That was why the Divine Hall apologized to the Tang Empire. However, if the Divine Priest of Light was right, and the son of Yama was awakened in the general's mansion. Then who could it be if not the son of Lin Guang'an? Yisu looked at him expressionlessly and said, "You know very well who it is." Eldest brother said, "Without evidence, there is no reason." Yisu said, "Everyone is dead, but Ninkei is still alive. This is the evidence." Eldest brother did not speak. Yisu's words were simple and seemed unreasonable, but they could not be refuted. To be able to survive under any circumstances, even when death seemed inevitable, if he was not the son of God who was protected by Haotian, then he could only be the hero of the story. The black line had descended on the human world for 15 years, and the story had begun for 15 years. No one knew that the hero of the story was the son of Yama. Yisu believed that Ninkei was the son of Yama. The morning light appeared in the distance in the east, and it was quiet on the city wall. After an unknown period of time, the eldest brother said, "Teacher once said that if we can't be sure of the existence above the sky, then we should maintain spiritual reverence or vigilance. However, we should not pay any attention to it in our lives in the real world. This is the way to get along." Then he looked at Yisu and said, "I am not sure if Ninkei is the son of Yama. I believe that he is not, but I am very sure that he is the youngest brother of the academy." Yisu quietly thought about the headmaster's words. After a while, he looked at the winter forest by the Yanming Lake and said indifferently, "Without evidence and without heaven's decree, even if Haotian Taoism has doubts, they will not do anything to Ning Quebec. I think the mute needs to hear these words, but I am very doubtful that he, who can no longer speak, can hear these words." The mute was not really mute, so naturally he would not be really deaf. The so-called can hear referred to whether he wanted to hear, and whether he was willing to believe the academy's words. Eldest brother looked at the winter forest and thought of the wayfarer of the Buddhism sect who was known for his perseverance. A faint look of worry appeared on his face. The wayfarer of the Buddhism sect had obviously come to Chang, and because of the rumor of the son of Yama. Since he dared to reveal his whereabouts, he naturally would not be afraid of the academy's pressure and harm Ning Quebec. He really did not have any good way to deal with the mute monk, because as he often repeated but no one believed, eldest brother was really not good at fighting. Yisu looked at the quiet night forest and always felt that something was wrong. Because in the previous battle, the mute monk did not make a move, and he always felt that there was someone else in the forest. However, in this world, who could avoid the eyes of him and Mr. First of the academy? At this moment, a sudden gust of wind blew in the winter forest by the lake. Along with the wind there was a large wave of sad cicadas that made people want to cry, but the cicadas sounded so happy. Listening to the cicadas, Yisu's face suddenly became extremely pale. It was not fear but solemnity. It was the emotion of meeting the most powerful enemy in his life. There was only a very clear whistling sound. The wooden sword on his back also whistled and suddenly unsheathed. The sword was like a ray of light, flying away from the city wall, piercing the last trace of darkness before dawn, and stabbing towards the winter forest. Then Yisu jumped down from the city wall. In the morning wind, his robe fluttered slightly, and he followed the sword. His body movement was indescribably wonderful, like a thin piece of snow in the wind, and actually seemed to be no slower than the flying sword. I haven't figured out the next volume yet, so I was afraid in advance. That's why it was very difficult to write today. I want to report to everyone, and I will draft the next volume in my mind before going to bed. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 488. The morning light was bright, and the winter forest was in chaos. A flying sword flew from the snow lake and danced among the withered trees at a high speed, accompanied by a whistling sound, looking for the place where the cicadas were chirping. A moment later, Yisu swept into the forest. His robe fluttered and he waved his right hand. The flying sword whistled back from afar and fell into his hand. Then he put it back into the scabbard on his back. The cicadas had stopped chirping, and no one knew where that person had gone. In the cold winter forest, there was only the mute monk covered in snow and the dead body of the Qinghe Prefecture's Minister of Offerings on the ground. Yisu looked at the rising sun in the east and saw the morning mist in the forest, which looked like thin and transparent cicada wings. He slowly raised his eyebrows and looked unprecedentedly serious. Eldest brother slowly walked in from outside the forest and stood beside him. He followed Yisu's gaze and looked in that direction without any expression. With the sound of falling snow, the armor-like snow on the mute monk cracked and fell, revealing his plain cotton kasaya. Then he slowly stood up and bowed to eldest brother and Yisu with folded palms. Eldest brother looked at the remaining snow between the monk's eyebrows and thought about the purpose of this world wayfarer of Buddhism. He could not help but frown and said, "Welcome, Master Qin Yan, to Chang and to preach Buddha." The world wayfarer of Xiankong Temple came to Chang, and this time to observe Ning Ke, the legendary son of Yama. He did not mean to be merciful, so eldest brother of the academy would not really welcome him. As for the last two words of preach Buddha, it was clear. Qin Yan looked calm, and the remaining snow between his eyebrows seemed to be firm. He listened to eldest brother's words and did not respond. "Last night at the winter lake, you kept silent in the winter forest and did not make a move. I always felt it was strange and thought that it was a teacher from the academy. I did not expect it to be that person. You have been practicing silent meditation for 15 years. Can't you stop that for a few steps?" Yisu looked at Qin Yan and asked. His expression was extremely serious and a bit cold. After the academy's youngest uncle Tianzhu, the biggest enemy of Taoism in the world was the 23-year cicada cultivation. However, the Devil's Doctrine Master was extremely mysterious. Even with the great power and influence of the West Hill Divine Palace in the world, they had not found any trace of him for decades. No one would have thought that when the world gathered in Chang'an, there would be cicadas chirping by the Yanming Lake. The most mysterious person in the world had once again appeared in the world. When the West Hill Divine Palace heard of this news, they would definitely be shocked and use all their power to search for the cicadas. As the successor of the Jisho Abbey, Yisu was even more vigilant. Qin Yan had been practicing the silent meditation for 15 years, and was extremely powerful. Once he opened his mouth, the sound of Buddha would be heard in the world. However, he did not open his mouth last night in the face of the mournful chirping of the 23-year cicada cultivation, and the silent but bone-chilling suppression of that person, because he was not sure that he could win against that person if he opened his mouth. Therefore, he did not answer Yisu's question at this time. Yisu knew the mute monk's temperament well. Seeing that he didn't speak, he knew that he couldn't get any information about the 23-year cicada cultivation from him. He turned to look at the eldest brother and said, "This is Chang'an." His words were simple, but the meaning was clear. This was not the West Hill or the Xiankong Temple, but Chang'an of the Tang Empire, the territory of the academy. The master of the Devil's Doctrine came and left at will, which was a provocation to the academy. At this time, the academy should at least give an explanation. The eldest brother said, "All these years, that person has been attacking General Xiahou. He has given the academy enough face. This time I didn't expect him to come out." Yisu looked at the dead minister of offerings from Qinghe County, and suddenly raised his finger to the thin piece of snow on his neck. He said, "He killed you in Chang'an. Does Mr. First not want to enforce the law of the Tang Empire on behalf of the academy?" The eldest brother sighed and said, "The academy does put the law of the Tang Empire first, but the law depends on the ability of the executor. The law of the Tang Empire can only restrict those who are able to be restricted by the Tangs. Neither the imperial court nor the academy can do anything to this person. We can't ask the headmaster for help." Yisu was puzzled. In his opinion, even though the headmaster of the academy had not been involved in the affairs of the world for many years, the reappearance of the 23-year cicada cultivation in the world was a big event. Was this not enough to alarm the headmaster? No one spoke or did not know what to say. The mysterious appearance and disappearance of the 23-year cicada cultivation made the three most powerful people in the academy, Taoism and Buddhism, subconsciously silent. The morning light gradually brightened, and the snow particles in the winter forest slowly danced in the light. They still looked like a large pair of cicada wings, but much fainter than before. Yisu looked at the snow fog in the morning light and the pair of cicada wings. Suddenly his expression changed slightly. Last night, he and the eldest brother had been watching Yanming Lake from the city wall, but they did not notice the movement in the winter forest. After all, the 23-year cicada cultivation in the winter forest was not facing an ordinary person, but Qin Yan, a powerhouse with no hindrance in Buddhism. How did that person do it? The devil's doctrine was not tolerated by the orthodox cultivation because the cultivators of the devil's doctrine tried in vain to replace the rules of Haotian, absorb the qi of heaven and earth and nature, and build a new world in the body. Had the grandmaster of the devil's doctrine surpassed this level? Could he cover the glory of Haotian with a light wave of the transparent cicada wings, and have a world of his own in nature? This showed that the movement in the winter forest by the lake could not be noticed by him and Mr. First of the Academy, and the people in the cliff around the lake could not notice it at all. The 23-year cicada cultivation was so powerful. Thinking of this, Yisu's face turned slightly pale. Then he felt very confused and felt that something was wrong. He silently sensed the aura left in the snow forest and fell into silence. While Yisu was silent, the eldest brother and Qin Yan had a conversation. Qin Yan was mute, so the conversation was naturally one-sided. It was more like a gentle, calm, but unquestionable announcement. No one knew the specific content of the conversation, but it must have something to do with Ning Quebec. Under the snow bridge, the soldiers of the Yulin Royal Guards were extremely tired. They did not feel too bad after a sleepless night, but they were blocked by one person for a whole night. They could only listen to the sound coming from the distant lake but could not participate in the battle, which made them feel ashamed and tired easily. Su Shi walked on the snow bridge and turned around in front of the second brother. He held the snow-covered railing and looked at the frozen river under the bridge. He said, "Am I really old?" The second brother slowly stood up and gently and carefully brushed off every remaining snow on his body to make sure that there was no wrinkle on his academy uniform. Then he said, "You are old." Su Shi was not angry, but indifferently said, "The academy is indeed a place that can create miracles. Ning Ke has done something that no one could think of. But do you really think it is fair?" The second brother walked to him and looked down the bridge. After a night of strong wind, the snow on the ice was piled up to the two sides, and the reflection of people and other things could be vaguely seen on the surface of the ice. He adjusted the position of the crown on his head to make sure that there was no deviation at all. He nodded in satisfaction and said in an unquestionable tone, "I do things faithfully." The wrinkles on Su Shi's face were very deep, which showed his old age in the morning wind. He said in a slightly hoarse voice, "Junemo, you have the style of an ancient gentleman. No one in the world dares to doubt you." But in the Battle of the Winter Lake last night, Ning Ke completed a fatal blow to Xiaoho with his little handmaiden. 2 against 1. How is it fair? The second brother said, "My youngest brother is a talisman master. According to the rules of the cultivation world, he can certainly have a valet during a challenge. There is no problem with this." Su Shi thought of the great light between the cliffs of Yanming Lake last night, and the thundering sound of weapons clashing on the lake. He frowned and said, "Ning Ke is not a simple talisman master. Miss Sang Sang is the only successor of the great divine priest of light. How can she be a valet?" Second brother said, "A talisman master is a talisman master. Even if youngest brother cultivates both martial arts and talismans, he is a talisman master if he says he is a talisman master. As for Sang Sang, even if she becomes the great divine priest of light of West Hill in the future, she can be a valet if she wants to be youngest brother's valet." Su Shi's face slightly darkened and said, "It turns out that Junemo also knows how to argue. I value reason and etiquette the most in the world. In this case, I am naturally good at using all kinds of means to make reason stand on my side. Not to mention arguing, I can even use force to fight." Second brother indifferently said, "Daoshi monk of Yueluan Kingdom had a valet warrior monk. It was the challenge letter issued by your military ministry, and the address information provided by your military ministry. If you didn't say it was unfair at that time, don't ever say it. Otherwise, the Academy doesn't mind asking the military ministry for advice on what is fair." After saying this, he turned around and walked to the other side of the snow bridge. The high crown on his head cast a very long shadow in the morning light, as if it was deeply engraved into the deep snow on the bridge. Su Shi looked at his gradually disappearing figure in silence. The person sitting cross-legged on the snow bridge left, so the snow bridge was open. For a day and a night, he didn't look at the scenery on the snow bridge. He just turned himself into a landscape painting, and no one dared to draw on it. An officer walked behind Su Shi and whispered something to him. Su Shi's voice was slightly hoarse as he said, "General Xiahou has made great contributions to the country, so he naturally needs to be restrained. As for his funeral, the palace will naturally arrange it. The military ministry just needs to be prepared." At this time in the imperial palace, the atmosphere was extremely depressing and tense. There were no eunuchs or palace maids around the snow hall, so only a few people could hear the empresses crying. These few people were also people other than the academy who knew about the sibling relationship between the empress and Xiahou. In the princess's mansion not far from the imperial palace, it was a completely different situation. After the Taoist with the yellow oiled paper umbrella under his armpit left to report the news, an indescribable atmosphere of celebration mixed with some shock and confusion began to spread in the rain corridors and balconies. Liu stroked her slightly rising and falling chest and looked at the cup of tea in front of her. It took her great willpower to calm herself down. Ning Ke actually defeated Xiahou. This had brought great benefits. Even a calm person like her felt a little dizzy. But the fact that Ning Ke was still alive made her suddenly relaxed. Li Huiyuan sat beside her, looking a little confused. Of course he knew that Xiahou was killed, and it was a good thing for him. But he couldn't understand why his sister and the counselors were so ecstatic. Could the Empress be sure of everything even if the military support was gone? He hadn't slept for a whole night, and now he just wanted to go to sleep. Liu waved her hand to let the counselors leave, but she didn't let him leave. The room was quiet. She looked at her favorite brother, and her clear eyes gradually became moist. She said in a slightly trembling voice, "After today, the future throne of the Tang Empire will be yours, my brother. I almost wrote myself to death. I want to vomit sitting in front of the computer. That's all for today. Tomorrow the second volume will officially end. I hope I can get through these few days. There are always a few days at the end of each volume. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." Chapter 489. Li Huiyuan was shocked by Liu's words. As a prince, he was not ignorant and incompetent. Of course, he knew how much benefit Xiahou's death would bring to him, but he still couldn't understand why his sister was so sure that he would be the next emperor. Liu looked at her brother, who was at a loss. She thought of how they had depended on each other since the death of their mother. She thought of the efforts and sacrifices she had made for her brother's throne. She could not help but have mixed feelings. She said, "Ning Ke is a student of the second floor of the academy. Xiahou was killed by him. How can that woman be close to the academy? No matter how hypocritical she is, the academy will not be on her side. How can her son be the emperor if there is an invisible gap between the academy and her?" Li Huiyuan finally came to his senses. Yes, without the support of the academy, father would not dare to hand over the empire to the empress, no matter how much he doted on that brat. Thinking of this, the young prince's breathing became heavier. He clenched his fists tightly, and his eyes were filled with excitement. There was even a ferocious look in his eyes. Li Huiyuan thought of another piece of news that Mingqi had told him before. He said with a little distress, "The third minister of offerings of Qinghe County died in Chang'an. I don't know how they will react." Liu frowned. She also felt that this matter was a little troublesome. Over the years, the big families of Qinghe County had given her a lot of financial support. She could relatively easily win over the courtiers in the court, and Qinghe County had also helped her behind the scenes. Now that their ancestor had died in Chang'an, she didn't know whether it would have any impact. The house by the Yinming Lake had been severely damaged in the battle last night. The beams were broken and the walls were destroyed. It was a mess everywhere. Only the remote side yard was relatively intact. Ning Ke and Sang Sang returned to the side yard. Under the care of Chan Pippi and Tang Xiaotang, they took a bath and applied medicine. After eating some food, they began to rest and then fell into a deep sleep. The security in the lane by the lake had been lifted. There was no more control except that the runners of the Cha and local government were maintaining order outside the house and forbidding citizens from coming to see what was going on. Under the command of Mr. Chi, the fish dragon gang rushed to the Yanming Lake as fast as they could and began to clean up and repair the house. However, the house was so badly damaged that it was obviously not something that could be done in 2 or 3 days. The maids and stewards who had been dismissed by Ning Ke before the war also returned to the house. Looking at the mess, they could not help but feel a little scared. Some even wanted to leave. However, their 10-year contract was in the Grand Secretary's mansion. When the Grand Secretary Zheng Jing and his wife went to see their daughter, they behaved. Since there were servants, Chan Pippi and Xiaotang returned to the academy. Chan Pippi and Tang returned to the academy and Tang went back to the academy. Since the servants were taken care, Chan and Xiaotang returned to Chang. Chin, you and I went. S Ming S and Li S Feng, and S and SSS, SSSS. S Ming SSSSSS, could, TS, SSSS, SSSS. Chan SSSS, Chen Stuesev. Ning Ke and Sang Sang were not seriously injured in the battle at the Winter Lake. It was not until Xia Ho used his iron spear that they started to bleed. However, this seemingly victorious battle still caused great damage to their spirits and bodies. After Ning Ke released the talisman storm in the house, triggered the explosion in the lotus field, and shot the 13 talisman arrows, the psyche power in his sense of perception and even the great spirit in his body were completely exhausted. Song Song's last burst of light on the cliff was almost a means of burning the essence of life. The light in the small building was gone, leaving only darkness. Her body was as cold as a block of ice. Ning Ke was very worried that the cold in her body would relapse. Before going to bed, he held her in his arms and warmed her body with his body temperature, just like in the past. However, his right arm was seriously injured because of the backfire of the talisman arrow. He was not used to using his left arm, so he only held her gently. The next morning Sang Sang woke up. However, she had a terrible headache and could not get up. Ning Ke was also extremely weak. He dragged her back to bed and asked the maids to bring her food and water. He did not allow her to get up to do housework. After lying in bed for 3 days and 3 nights, Ning Ke's spirit gradually recovered. He climbed out of bed and entered the garden in the morning light. He found his padao and began to hack and slash. The sound of the padao whistled and the cold light shone like snow. Suddenly he seemed to have thought of something and stopped. He stood in the middle of the winter courtyard. His body seemed to be a little stiff. He looked at the padao in his hand and remained silent for a long time. In the past few years, as long as there were no emergencies, he would get up early in the morning and wash and eat with Song Song's help. Then he would start to practice. Whether it was his swordsmanship, archery or meditation, he had never slacked off. This was because he was always facing the threat of death and the pressure of revenge. This morning seemed to be the same as the other ordinary mornings in the past. But in fact, this morning was very different from the past. He was now a student of the 2nd floor of the academy. There were not many people in the world who could threaten his life. Moreover, Xia Ho was already dead. Since Xia Ho was already dead, what was the point of practicing? Ning Ke held the heavy padao and stood in silence for a long time. Then he continued to wave the blade. Every stroke was so concise and sharp, and every movement was so meticulous. He did not understand why he had to practice, so he did not think about it for the time being. Just as he had once said to eldest brother, these things were all the world and scenery that he had once lived in. For a while, he could not get rid of the powerful strength that he was used to, and he did not want to get rid of it. In the following winter days, the house by the Yanming Lake was gradually repaired by the craftsmen recruited by the Fish Dragon gang. Naturally, it cost a lot of money. In order to make up for this debt, Ningke had to use the bonus that Qiao Shaoshu had left for him in the casino in the western city in advance, and he even paid it in advance for the next year. Ningke and Sangsang did not go anywhere. They had been staying in the house. Perhaps they were not used to the quiet and aimless life, or perhaps the injuries left by the battle at the Winter Lake had not really healed. Anyway, both of them were not in good spirits and seemed a little listless. This kind of listless feeling was not the feeling of a scholar beside a snow lake. It was just extreme fatigue after extreme relaxation. Of course, Ningke still maintained an extremely high level of vigilance. Although the battle at the Winter Lake was a fair duel, Xiahou was, after all, the great general of the empire. He had countless colleagues and friends in the army and the imperial court. Now that he had died in Ningke's hands, who knew if there were any undercurrents surging in Chang'an? He had admitted in front of the palace that he was not the son of the Xianwei general, Lin Guangyuan. His Majesty's special pardon naturally did not count. Would the imperial court continue to investigate those murders? Nearly 10 officials or generals of the Tang Empire had died tragically in his hands. Would the empire that followed the law of the Tang Empire remain silent? What happened next was completely beyond Ningke's expectations. Xiahou's funeral was solemn and silent. The Zhenjuan general's mansion was sealed, and everyone in the general's mansion, including the two young masters Xiahou, embarked on their journey home. No one mentioned those murders, including the toughest military in the past. Now it had become unusually quiet. Other than the Grand Secretary Zhengjing and his wife who came twice, no one from the imperial court actually stepped into the house by the Yanming Lake. It was as if there had not been a confrontation in front of the palace a few days ago, and there had not been a fierce battle at the Winter Lake. It was as if nothing had happened in Chang'an. On a snowy morning, Yi Hongyu had also left the Yanming Lake. Ningke and Sangsang held the big black umbrella and sent her to the gate of the courtyard. He looked at the newly renovated courtyard gate and recalled the scene on that rainy day. He sighed and said, "I really did not think that I would actually live with you for half a year." Yi Hongyu said, "You'd better not say such shallow and boring words in the future." "I will try to say something elegant and boring in the future." Ningke said, "You were forced to escape from the divine hall because you offended the great divine priest of judgment. After leaving Chang'an, where can you find a piece of pure land in the world? According to what you said that day, Yi Su would not care about the affairs of the divine hall, nor would he care about your life. Aren't you worried that you will be killed by the divine hall?" Yi Hongyu said, "Life and death is the most personal thing, and it is also something that people can't control themselves. We can't pin our hopes on others, even my brother. But I want to control myself. You are a Taoist. I will not engage in such a mysterious debate with you." Ningke replied with a smile. Then he reached out and brushed off a thin layer of snow that fell on his shoulder. With this action, the extremely shallow dimples on his face suddenly became clear. Yi Hongyu looked at the shallow dimples on his face and looked at his smile. She thought silently, what kind of life can make such a shameless and cold-blooded guy have such a beautiful smile? There is something that I have never understood. She suddenly said. Ningke was slightly startled and asked, "What is it?" Yi Hongyu said, "In terms of cultivation talent, I am clearly far better than you. However, my understanding of the paper sword is far inferior to yours. From the West Hill to Chang'an, I exhausted a lot of energy and finally understood most of it. However, you only looked at it for a night and could imitate the sword style and sword momentum so well." Ningke thought about it and said, "I don't really understand either. Have you thought of an answer?" Yi Hongyu said, "That day on the snow lake, you condensed the day sword style on the saber and stabbed it into Xiahou's body. At that time I saw the scene and the sword momentum that was like a torrential turbid wave. Thinking of your tragic life, I vaguely thought of a possibility." Ningke asked, "What possibility?" Yi Hongyu said, "The true meaning of the paper sword is not that it is so thin that there is no gap that it cannot penetrate and kill everyone. It is also not that it is the majestic momentum of the vast ocean falling from the sky. It is the simplest principle of water flow. All the water in the world will inevitably flow downwards and cannot be traced back. This is absolute no return. In other words, you will do what you think is right. In this aspect there is no doubt that you are a powerhouse." Ninkei said with a smile, so this is the principle. I originally thought that you were going to say that I am a despicable person, so I can understand such a despicable swordsmanship. There is more today. I will finish the second volume. When will I finish it? I don't know. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 490. Ninkei looked at Yihongyu and said, "You understood this, so you left Chang'an?" Yihongyu said, "Yes." Ninkei said, "But you haven't thanked me yet." Yihongyu said, "This is my sword. You should thank me." Ninkei said, "We don't need to thank each other." Yihongyu said, "We don't owe each other anything." After saying this, she turned around and left. The thin snow gradually flew and her indigo dress gradually fluttered. Looking at the back of the Taoist girl gradually disappearing in the wind and snow, Ninkei was silent. He and the Tao addict were life and death enemies in the wilderness. They were comrades who fought side by side in the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. Now they had spent half a year together in the house by the Yanming Lake. Although they did not have much friendship, they were familiar with each other's existence. He thought that if she could survive this trip, they would probably fight again with swords drawn. Either he or she would die. Thinking of this, he could not help but sigh. Finally, he said to Sang Sang, "I admire this woman very much." Because of the battle between Ninkei and Xiaohou at the Winter Lake, many powerhouses came to Chang'an. Although the Abbey Dean of the Jishou Abbey and the chief preaching monk of the Xiankong Temple did not appear, the hierarch of the West Hill Divine Palace, the great divine priest, and some Vedantas of the Buddhism sect did not come, the scene was shocking enough. The world wayfarers of Taoism and Buddhism sects and the minister of offerings of Qinghe County all appeared by the Yanming Lake. Although the Sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom only sent an inconspicuous messenger, everyone knew that he represented Liu Bai. The most unexpected thing was that the Devil's Doctrine suzerain, the 23-year cicada cultivation, reappeared in the world. With so many powerhouses gathered in Chang'an, they were most concerned about the ending of Xiaohou, the Taoist sect's guest elder, and the legend that Ninkei was the son of Yama. However, if one thought about it carefully, they could taste more meaning. It seemed to be a cautious test of the academy by the cultivation world. Faced with this test, the academy did not do much. Mr. Second sat on the snow bridge for a night, Mr. First chatted with Yisu for a night, and then chatted with Qin Yan for a long time. In the end, Ninkei defeated Xiaohou in a way that shocked the entire cultivation world. 23-year cicada cultivation disappeared mysteriously again. Qin Yan, the world wayfarer of Xiankong Temple, meditated in the Wanyan Tower for 10 days after hearing a long speech from the eldest brother of the academy, and then left Chang'an. These things once again proved a truth that the academy could not be shaken. The people of General Xiaohou's mansion left Chang'an, and so did Yi Hongyu. A few days later, even Yisu was ready to leave, so the eldest brother of the academy came to see him off. Yisu looked at the renovated little Taoist temple, and thought that his sweat might have fallen on the black roof tiles and thick beams. He felt somewhat happy. After a while, his smile faded and he said, "I still don't understand." Eldest brother knew what he was confused about. He smiled and said, "Tang's fist, Liu Bai's sword, Yensei's fu paper, the Back Mountain's knives and arrows, and Sang Sang, the successor of the great divine priest of light. How could Xiaohou not be defeated? Besides, he is a member of the academy. How could he not win?" Yisu was silent for a long time. Suddenly, he laughed loudly and said, "How could a member of the academy not win? What an unreasonable statement." His laughter echoed on the snowy street. This proud successor of the Jishou Abbey had entered the human realm to cultivate in Chang'an. He had a lucky chance in the broken eaves of the street and the ruins of the little Taoist temple. His extremely high state had been improved again. When he heard the words about the academy, he finally understood the cause of everything and floated away. After confirming that Chang'an had really returned to peace and that no one tried to test the academy, Ninkei would not continue to stay in the house by the lake. He took Sang Sang to the House of Red Sleeves. Mistress Jian sighed and said, "You are becoming more and more like him." Ning Ke shook his head and said, "Youngest uncle and I are not like each other." Mistress Jian said, "You have not met your youngest uncle. But I know I don't look like him. Because youngest uncle is a free and easy person, and I can never live a free and easy life." Ning Ke laughed and said, "Of course I can learn from him in the future." Then, the two left the House of Red Sleeves and sat in a black horse carriage out of the Vermilion Bird Gate. They went along the straight official road covered with snow, and came to the mountain in the south of the city. Then they drove directly into the academy. Ning Ke did not know the truth and details of what had happened in Chang, and during the battle between him and Xiahou. It seemed that the senior brothers of the academy did not help him, but he was very clear that they must have done a lot of things in silence under such a difficult situation. In the hut, he took Sang Sang and bowed deeply to eldest brother and second brother to express their gratitude. Then he thanked fourth brother, sixth brother and seventh sister, the talisman arrow, the iron knife and the array by the lake. The senior brothers and sisters accepted Ning Ke's salute calmly, reservedly, or perhaps proudly. Second brother, who was usually the most indifferent, looked extremely gentle at this time. It seemed that Ning Ke, as a senior brother, felt deeply honored that his youngest brother could defeat and kill Xiahou. Third sister Yu Lian was not at the back of the mountain. As usual, she was writing hairpin-style small regular script by the east window of the old library. She looked calm and focused. Suddenly, she looked up at the falling snowflakes outside the window and smiled. She raised her hand to her lips and gently breathed out the hot air, feeling much warmer. Tang Xiaoting was her disciple. She had no homework today, so she was grinding the ink in the old library. At this time the little girl's hands were already sore, but her little face was still full of sweet smile. Third sister was a little confused and asked, "What makes you so happy?" "My brother has always wanted to kill the traitor Xiahou. I heard that he was seriously injured in the wilderness to kill him. He must be very happy to know this news." Tang Xiaoting raised her arm and wiped away the tears of happiness. She looked at her teacher and nodded hard. She smiled and said, "If the headmaster is still alive, he must be very happy." One day the snow in Chang and suddenly became heavy and fell on the city. It was a violent mess. Ning Ke happened to go to the tombs on that day, so he had to go out of the city against the wind and snow. Ning Ke and Sang Sang first went to the grave in the deep grass near the academy, and talked to Yin Sei about some boring things. Then he poured a jar of new wine in front of the grave and took out an undergarment that still had its fragrance from his bosom. He covered it with the wind and snow and burned it. Sang Sang said uneasily, "Will Dewdrop be angry?" Ning Ke said, "How will she know if you don't tell her?" After finishing these things, he and Sang Sang took a carriage to another cemetery. They followed the address that the bodyguard office helped them to find. After many turns in the forest of tombstones, they finally found Darky's grave. Ning Ke gently brushed away the snow on the tombstone and looked at the name. He said with a sense of guilt, "When we were young, we agreed that if someone died first, the one who killed Xiahou would bring his head to the grave of the one who died first. I'm sorry that I didn't do it." Xiahou's body was sealed in the coffin after being fished out of the lake by the military. I was also embarrassed to break the coffin and behead him. But I heard that he looked very miserable, like a piece of meat stewed in a pot. After saying these disgusting words, Ning Ke laughed happily. Then he took the two parts of the dark and heavy broken spear from Song Song's hands and deeply put them into the frozen soil of the tomb, like two long sticks of incense. There is one more chapter. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 491. In the past few years, Ning Ke had not come to pay his respects to Darky in order not to attract attention. Now that he had gotten his revenge, even if the imperial court knew about his relationship with Darky, they would not have to worry. Since he had gotten his revenge, he should pay his respects to his parents first. However, after the murder case, the bodies of Ning Ke's biological parents, Lin Hai and Li Sanyang, were burned into ashes and scattered into the Wei River after a simple worship by Haotian Taoism. There was no cemetery. Then Darky's grave could be counted as the graves of those people. The wind and snow became stronger and stronger. Sang Sang opened the big black umbrella and held it tightly with both hands to cover his back. Ning Kei squatted down and took out a piece of oiled paper from his arms and burned it. There were many names written on the oiled paper. The people behind those names were all dead. Just like the oiled paper, they turned into smoke and were instantly blown away by the wind and snow. Sang Sang whispered, "What about His Highness?" Ning Kei looked at the rolling ashes on the snow and said, "He only talked back then. Now he has paid a price for not becoming a prince. Let's watch him for another 2 years." Sang Sang said, "Young master, don't you always say that you want to kill the chief evil?" Ning Kei said, "The chief evil is your teacher, but he is already dead. When I looked at his grave I thought about digging it up, but I gave up." When Chang'an was shrouded in the wind and snow, the deep mountains of the West Hill Divine Kingdom were still as warm as spring. This had something to do with the warm current on the sea outside the Song Kingdom's dike in the east. It was also because this was originally a place favored by Haotian. A young man stood outside the simple Taoist temple in the deep mountains. The man was extremely handsome. Although there were a few eye-catching scars on his cheeks, they added to his charm. The middle-aged Taoist on the stone steps looked at the young man and said, "Prince Longqing, do you really insist on entering the temple to cultivate? Do you know what this means?" The young man turned out to be Prince Longqing. There were calluses and rust marks on his palms. Perhaps he had spent the past few days on the sea. He said respectfully, "Since it is the teacher's order as a disciple, I dare not disobey. As long as I can see the tomes of arcane, I don't care how much pain and torture I have to endure." The middle-aged Taoist said, "Since it is the Abbey Dean's intention, no one will stop you. But I have to remind you that with your current state, you may die at any time if you want to read the tomes of arcane." Longqing said calmly, "Martial uncle, I am a dead man now." The middle-aged Taoist priest looked at the black peach blossom on Longqing's chest and thought of the rumor that Ning Kei had pierced through this man's chest with an arrow on the snow cliff. He understood what Longqing meant by the so-called dead man. He sighed and said nothing more. He walked up the stone steps and entered the unknown place of Jishou Abbey. Although Longqing had already become the disciple of the Abbey Dean of Jishou Abbey, he was still a little nervous. At the lakeside in the depths of the Taoist temple, there were 7 splendid thatched cottages in picturesque disorder. The thatched cottages were paved with grass, cheap and shabby. They shouldn't have any dignified and luxurious aura, but the thatched cottages were like gold and jade, disregarding the years of dust and wind, appearing extremely magnificent. This kind of grass naturally contained extremely rich qi of heaven and earth. It could resist the cold aura of wind and rain and help people calm down. It had long been extinct in the natural world and could be said to be extremely precious. There were only 2 places in the world that were luxurious enough to use this kind of thatched cottages. One was the cottage by the lakeside that was responsible for storing the 7 volumes of tomes of arcane, and the other was the drafty thatched cottage that the headmaster of the academy lived in. Longqing walked into the first cottage and looked at the classic on the agarwood table, which was covered in black blood. He could no longer keep his calm, and his hands that were exposed outside his sleeves trembled slightly. This classic was the first volume of the tomes of arcane, the Re-Hand Scroll. This was also the only volume of the tomes of arcane that he could open at his current state. Longqing slowly opened the black cover. The first page that came into view was a snow-white piece of paper. Then he turned to the second page. On this piece of paper were written the names of Liu Bai, Jun and Mo Tang. These were the most powerful cultivators in the world. Because he had already expected it, he was not surprised. He just silently thought that if he wanted to climb to the highest peak of cultivation in the future, then these shining names must be the stepping stones under his feet. Longqing continued to read the Re-Hand Scroll. At the top of this piece of paper, he saw the name of the calligraphy addict, Mo Shanshan. Then he saw the names of Ning Kei and Yi Hongyu at the top of this piece of paper. These 2 names were almost completely parallel, and each stroke broke out of the paper, as if they were going to pierce into the previous page. Looking at these three names, Longqing's eyes became extremely resentful, and his breathing became much heavier. However, after a moment, all the emotions inexplicably disappeared. His eyes returned to extreme calmness, and became brighter and brighter, like a night pearl that had been painted with a golden luster, incomparably bright. Winter turned to spring and time passed day by day. No one in the world knew that Prince Longqing, who was thought to be dead, was now concentrating on cultivation and learning in the Jishou Abbey, an unknown place. When he woke up every morning, he would start to clean the front of the abbey, cook food, prepare daily necessities, and send them to the back of the abbey. After he was done with his work, he could only go to the 7 thatched cottages to read the tomes of arcane. After reading the hand scroll on the first day, Longqing did not open it again. Instead, he put all his spirit and will into reading the second volume of the tomes of arcane. One spring day, wild peaches bloomed both inside and outside the Jishou Abbey. Longqing came out of the second thatched cottage with a pale face. He held a blood-stained towel tightly in his hand, and was about to meditate and rest by the lake. Suddenly he felt something and stopped in his tracks. He walked into the first thatched cottage and opened the hand scroll with a solemn expression. On that page, the ink of the 2 words Ning Ke became thicker and thicker, as if blood was about to seep into the paper. Mo Shanshan's name left its original position and moved to the top of the paper. There was a stone pillar with sharp edges between the 2 words, as if it would burst the paper at any time. Longqing's face became paler, and his pupils suddenly shrank like dark holes. What shocked and angered him was not what he saw, but what he did not see. He did not see Yi Hongyu's name. Yi Hongyu's name had already gone somewhere else. Peach Mountain was in late spring. Although the newly planted peach blossoms were not as dazzling as rumored, the trees were lush and the divine hall above was shrouded in dense green, looking extremely solemn. On the stone divine path between the green trees, a girl walked slowly. She had a simple Taoist bun and wore a green Taoist robe. The green color was not very eye-catching, but when the Taoist robe slowly fluttered in the mountain wind, the green on the 1,000-year-old stone trees beside the divine path all lost their color. The girl with the Taoist bun walked calmly along the long divine path. Soon she came to the vast and flat cliff platform. She looked at the black divine hall of judgment in the distance and smiled. On the cliff platform in front of the divine hall, there were countless exclamations. Yi Hongyu is back. How dare this woman come back? Tao addict. Go and inform the great divine priest. Priest, long time no see. The girl from Haotian Taoism walked slowly. She was extremely beautiful, but her aura was extremely simple. But in the eyes of the crowd, this was the most terrible scene they had ever seen. The divine priests and deacons around the divine hall exclaimed and scattered in all directions. Those who could not retreat in time bowed in horror and greeted her with trembling voices. Last spring, Tao addict Yi Hongyu left the West Hill Divine Palace. She lived in Chang, and for a while and then disappeared without a trace. But this spring she came back. Chanbachi, the former commander of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall, was blinded by a paper sword. Then, his tongue was smashed by the great divine priest of Revelation's dry fingers. He became a real cripple. But after all, he was a trusted follower of Luo Kadi, so he could still live happily in the extremely realistic judicial department. If basking in the sun every day on the stone steps could be considered a kind of happiness, Yi Hongyu walked to the stone steps of the divine hall of judgment and looked at Chanbachi, who was dressed luxuriously but lying in the sun like a beggar. She said calmly, "Have you ever thought that I could come back?" Many divine priests and deacons in the distance looked over, but no one dared to do anything to Yi Hongyu. It was not because the Tao addict's prestige still existed, but because the great divine priest of Revelation was furious because the Tao addict had left the mountain after he returned to the Peach Mountain last year. He even had a fight with the great divine priest of judgment that no one knew about. Chunbachi had heard people's exclamations earlier. Hearing Yi Hongyu's voice, he finally confirmed that what he was most afraid of had finally happened. His face was full of fear. He wanted to beg for mercy and also wanted to warn Yi Hongyu that this was before the divine hall. He wanted to use the prestige of the great divine priest of judgment and Luo Kadi to save his life. But he could not speak now. Even if he could speak, Yi Hongyu was not prepared to listen. She just wanted to enter the divine hall of judgment and had to climb the stone steps. And this person happened to be basking on the stone steps, so she spoke casually. After saying this, she walked past Chinbachi. A spring breeze blew gently, ruffling the ancient trees around the divine hall and wrinkling Yi Hongyu's sleeves. A tiny wrinkle appeared on her green sleeves, which was shaped like a sword. The invisible Taoist sword appeared. Chunbachi's throat was cut and he died on the spot. Yi Hongyu did not look back and continued to walk up the stone steps. More than 100 divine priests and deacons walked to the stone steps of the divine hall and looked up. They were shocked to see the green robe slowly walking up the stone steps. The dark and solemn divine hall of judgment was extremely tall and solemn. Compared to it, Yi Hongyu, who was standing in front of the hall, seemed so small. But she did not stop and walked in calmly and naturally. It was like coming home. When she walked into the divine hall of judgment, she was no longer small. In a house somewhere in the capital of the Great River Kingdom, the sound of a baby crying could be heard. The maids and servants in the courtyard were busy with joy. The owner of the house was a Tang, which was a good thing for the people of the Great River Kingdom. Moreover, this owner was gentle, had a deep relationship with his wife, and treated his servants generously. He was the best owner. Today their owner was pregnant and they were also happy. The woman lying on the bed looked pale and her forehead was full of sweat. She looked extremely tired. But looking at the baby in her husband's arms, she still could not hide her excitement. She murmured, "It's a pity that it's a daughter. I'll give you a son next time." The middle-aged man sitting by the bed looked at his wife and comforted her with the baby in his arms. "It's best to have a daughter. In the future, let her enter the black ink garden to learn calligraphy and be elegant. If she gives birth to a naughty boy, it will be difficult to arrange. Who knows when he will learn to climb over walls and join those Jianghu people." The woman said angrily, "How can you say that?" The middle-aged man looked at the baby girl in his arms and said nervously, "Why is she so small? How old can a newborn child be?" The woman suddenly became nervous and said in a trembling voice, "Master, are we really going back to Chong, and in the autumn?" The middle-aged man smiled and said, "Father is old. Now that we have a child, we have to bring her back to make him happy. You don't have to worry about those trivial things. I'll take care of everything." The woman always thought that her husband was the most reassuring person in the world. Hearing this, she was really relieved and began to think about other things. She asked, "What should we name the child?" "After returning to Chong, and we'll wait for father to give us a name." The middle-aged man thought that when they returned to Chong and His Majesty would definitely rush to give him a name when he knew that he had a daughter. He could not help but smile bitterly and said, "Let's give her a nickname first. What should we call her? The village we met was rich in pumpkins. How about Little Pumpkin?" "Whatever you say." The word born was used to describe the birth of a new life. Sometimes, it was used to describe the relaxed mood after things were settled. In the Mogan Mountains in the west of the Great River Kingdom, there was a quiet lake. This quiet lake was the most famous ink lake in the Great River Kingdom. Emo Shanshan sat by the ink lake with a stone in her hand. She seemed to be ready to throw it into the lake or put it beside her, but she was still hesitating. On the ground beside her, there were already 7 or 8 stones scattered around. Some were round, some were square, and some were in different shapes. There seemed to be no order to their placement, but it gave people a feeling of extreme emptiness. This emptiness was like the stomach after starving for 5 days, or like an empty wineskin. The night wind blew gently. Emo Shanshan frowned, her thin and sparse eyelashes fluttering gently. Her originally slightly round cheeks had become thinner, making her even more beautiful. However, there was no self-pity or remorse on her pale cheeks. She was extremely focused and even seemed to be in pain because she was thinking. After an unknown amount of time, she finally put down the stone in her hand. The stone seemed to be placed randomly in the middle of the 7 or 8 stones on the ground. However, at this moment, something very strange happened. It was like a person who had been hungry for several days suddenly ate a large bucket of hard rice. Or like someone threw a knife into a wineskin. A strong sense of sharpness suddenly enveloped the ink lake. Many waves appeared on the calm lake surface, as if even the lake water had sensed the rugged feeling that stretched between heaven and earth and blocked people's hearts. Emo Shanshan looked at the scattered stones around her, and knew that she had finally succeeded in setting up a part of the stone array tactics. Her lake-like eyes became brighter and brighter, and her red lips were tightly pressed together because of joy. At this moment she remembered the words she wrote in the letter. After so many things, the rivers and mountains in my eyes have a new meaning. On the day we meet again, what I write will definitely be more magnificent than what I write today. I hope you will also work harder and not let me down. The girl stood up and looked to the distant north. Thinking of that hateful guy, she said sweetly and proudly, I have already known my destiny. Will you let me down? Peerless figures like Ku Haoran, the youngest uncle of the academy, and Master Lotus had long disappeared, leaving only a few traces in the world. However, even these traces were extremely precious treasures. Back in the Tianqi Mountains in the depths of the wilderness, Ning Ke, Emo Shanshan, and Yi Hongyu fought against each other and entered the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. In the process, they saw the great blockage formation set up by the great divine priest of light who founded the Devil's Doctrine. They saw the shocking sword marks left by Mr. Ku when he broke the stone array tactics. They saw the letter left by Ku Haoran in the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, the traces of that battle, and most importantly, Lotus who was still alive. That was a bloody encounter. The three young experts of the cultivation world suffered great devastation both mentally and physically in front of this old monster. And they also gained extremely valuable experience. These experiences settled in their spiritual world, and then gradually began to be released and began to play a role. Ning Ke killed Xia Ho. Emo Shanshan entered the knowing destiny state, and Yi Hongyu bravely walked into the divine hall of judgment, all thanks to the trip to the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. In a sense, neither youngest uncle nor Lotus had really died. The mantle of these two peerless powerhouses had been inherited by Ning Ke, and the other two in a new way. Standing on the precipice at the back of the mountain of the academy and looking at Chang and city in the distance, Ning Ke recalled what had happened in the past 2 years. Climbing the old library, climbing the second floor, comprehending talisman Taoism, entering the wilderness, inheriting the Great Spirit, and cultivating and fighting that he could never imagine before. Then he remembered what Xia Ho had said before he died and frowned slightly. He felt that there were invisible black clouds floating above Chang, and city that was covered by the clear spring sunshine. He thought that he could not be the son of Yama. Although he had died once, in a sense he had seen Yama, but that Yama was obviously not the same Yama in this world. But if he was not the son of Yama, why did the great divine priest of light cause such a bloody storm? Why did the Buddhism sect send people to see him and even kill him? He could not see the future clearly, and he did not know whether the Buddhism sect would be peaceful. Ning Ke slightly clenched his fists and made a decision. He would not attend the Yulan Hungry Ghost Festival in autumn. At this moment, the lively music and noise forcibly pulled him out of the high-level emotions such as sighing and vigilance, and pulled him back to the scene of the spring outing. Today was the spring outing in the back mountain of the academy. Under the organization of the headmaster of the academy, no disciple dared not to come. Anyway, the inhibition of the cliff cave had been removed, so the senior brothers who liked to play chess played chess in the cave. The senior brothers who liked to play the zither and flute sang and played songs in the cave. Those who liked to embroider continued to embroider, those who liked to read continued to read, those who liked to write small regular script continued to write small regular script, those who liked to chat continued to chat, and those who liked to pretend to be lonely continued to pretend to be lonely. These were all very elegant hobbies, but when these hobbies appeared at the same time in the cliff cave, it suddenly became vulgar because it was too noisy, too much like the scene of performing on the streets in Chang, and Sang Sang was the one who really worked hard today, because she was responsible for preparing the food, and under Chan Pippi's strong request, she boiled 3 large urns of chicken soup. Young master, drink it quickly. It's the freshest. Sang Sang carried a bowl of chicken soup, quietly walked to the cliff edge and handed it to him. Ning-Kei looked at her slightly messy hair and the grass dust on her face, and could not help but feel a little distressed. He said angrily, Chun Pippi made a fool of you, and you actually listened to him. Is the chicken soup calligraphy and chicken soup the same thing? The chicken soup calligraphy is sold for a lot of silver, but does that make the chicken soup more precious? Sang Sang smiled and did not say anything. In fact, she was very happy that people in the academy liked to drink the chicken soup she made. She reminded him, this chicken is very good, and it can produce a lot of oil. There is a thick layer of soup floating on top, so it looks like there is no heat, but in fact it is very hot. It will not cool in a short time. Young master, you should blow on it before drinking. Sang Sang went to the hut to prepare salad and steamed buns in the big pot. Eldest brother walked out of the cliff cave, stood beside Ning-Kei, and looked in the direction of Chang'an. Ning-Kei handed the bowl to him and said, Senior brother, this is the freshest bowl. Eldest brother smiled and shook his head. After a moment of hesitation he said, Younger brother, actually I have a question in my heart. I know this question is wrong, but it always makes me a little flustered. Ning-Kei said, Senior brother, please tell me. Eldest brother looked at the distant Chang'an city, frowned slightly and asked, 15 years ago, when you picked up the knife in the woodshed, did you ever think that the general's son was actually innocent? Ning-Kei was slightly stunned, and after thinking for a moment he said, it was very chaotic at that time, and I really don't know what I was thinking at that time. But I will naturally understand later. Then he sincerely asked, Senior brother, if you were in the same situation at that time, what would you choose? Eldest brother said, without personal experience, even the most touching choice might just be false sensationalism, but if it were me now, I would probably choose to do nothing. Ning-Kei knew that eldest brother was speaking from the bottom of his heart. Sacrificing the innocent for his own survival was probably not a choice that eldest brother would make. He said, Senior brother, you are a benevolent person. He continued, Second brother is a man of ideals, but it is really difficult for me to be one. I am just a selfish person, and I only want to survive. Eldest brother patted him on the shoulder and said, Teacher once said that selfishness is the biggest driving force for human beings to move forward. Although I don't really understand this saying, I think there must be a reason behind it. Younger brother, your choice is not wrong, at least I am not qualified to say that you are wrong. It is not that there must be a reason, but it is very reasonable. The headmaster walked to the edge of the cliff and said, There is no purpose in life, only the process. How can there be right and wrong? Eldest brother said, Right and wrong are the benevolence of human beings. The headmaster pointed to the blue sky and a few white clouds above and said, The higher you fly, the smaller your image in the eyes of people on the ground, until you become inhuman. You are not even a human, so how can there be benevolence? If there is no benevolence, how can there be right and wrong? Eldest brother shook his head and said, Teacher, you are wrong. During our travels, you often told me that it would be too cold to leave the human world, so if we stay in the human world, we must be human. Since we are human, we are one of the living beings in the world. How can we not have a sense of right and wrong? Ning-Kei was shocked. The headmaster had never thought that the most honest eldest disciple would dare to say that he was wrong to his face, and even use his own words to slap his own face. He was so angry that his beard fluttered, and he glared at him and scolded, Li Man, how dare you? Eldest brother said nervously, Teacher often reminds me to learn more from Junemo and youngest brother. That is why I said those words. If you don't like it, I will take them back. Ning-Kei listened by the side and tried to hold back his laughter until his stomach ached. At this moment, he really could not hold it anymore and burst out laughing. He waved his hands and said, You guys talk first, I will go see if the steamed buns are ready. The headmaster glared at him and said, You are the one who caused all this trouble, and you still want to escape? After saying this, he saw the bowl of chicken soup in Ning-Kei's hands and praised, The oil is crystal clear, and the soup is clear and rich. What a good bowl of soup. Ning-Kei's expression was slightly stiff. The headmaster flicked his sleeves and snatched the bowl of chicken soup from Ning-Kei's hands. He drank it in one gulp, and his expression did not change. Ning-Kei was shocked and speechless. He thought that the headmaster was really powerful. Then the headmaster's expression suddenly changed. and he spat out all the chicken soup in his mouth. His clothes and beard were dripping with oil, and he looked very embarrassed. Hot! The headmaster shouted in anger and pain, and even his tone changed. Sang, who was picking wisteria under the roofed corridor, asked confusedly, "Should I add sugar to the chicken soup?" There was a burst of laughter by the cliff. Volume 2, The End of the Lake in Winter. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 492. At this moment I was indeed a little tired. I had originally wanted to write it tomorrow, but tomorrow was the beginning of the next volume. I was most afraid that I would not be able to write it if I left it until tomorrow. Thus I would casually chat with everyone for a while. I was quite satisfied with the last chapter. I picked up all the things at the beginning and extended it to the huge plot of joining the devil. Looking back, it was probably more vivid. In any world, when the previous generation dies and the next generation grows up, there will be such things as inheritance. The North Sea volume of the Qingyu era talked about the inheritance of power. In this volume, there were also some parts that talked about inheritance, but it was relatively more ethereal. I wanted to talk about the inheritance of willpower and spirit. Although I did not have such things, it did not mean that the people in the story could not have them. This volume was very long. After careful consideration, I was sure that some of the plots could be written more concisely and quickly. However, when I was writing, it was really difficult to control. These were definitely the correct conclusions after looking back. However, I had been constantly making corrections. For example, in terms of the plots, there were many parts that could be written in detail, so I simplified them. For example, in terms of the dialogues, my dialogues were much simpler and clearer than before. I had once said that it had the feeling of the Vermilion Bird era. And it was indeed true. Back then I wrote dialogues like this and I liked it. The reason why the second volume, Lake of Winter, was so long was because there was too much content. The Desolate Man wore the opening of the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, the Ming Handscroll of the Tomes of Arcane, the Inheritance of the Great Spirit, the Birth of Lotus 32, Joining the Devil, the Revelation of Song Song's Birth, the Inheritance of the Light, the two of them killing Xiaoho, and so on. All kinds of important characters appeared one after another, leading to the big show at the end. Joining the Devil and killing Xia Ho were the two longest plots. Of course, it was because they were the most important. There was a separate chapter on joining the devil. Other than joining the devil, it was more important to talk about the background of the previous generation, as well as the root of the conflict in this story. Of course, killing Xia Ho was also important. That was the biggest goal of Ning Kei's life in the first half of his life. However, I thought that from the beginning of the book, no one would think that Xiaoho was the big boss. Yes, there were many bosses in this story, but it could also be said that there were no bosses. As I said before, I hope to write this story happily, simply, and pleasantly. Then I wanted to use as few twists and turns as possible. Simple is powerful. Don't I often say this nonsense? The curtain of this world had already been pulled open. Most of the characters had already appeared on stage. Next, they had to perform on this stage. I did not know whether they would sing well or not. Anyway, I would try my best to write. The content of the next volume was not to mention. I wanted to try to write as much to them as possible. To be honest, though I have been anxiously preparing for the third volume these last few days, I have not even thought of a title. Although I have been anxiously preparing for the third volume these days, I have not even thought of a title. The second volume, Winter Lake, starts from the north of Yin Kingdom. In the middle is the Daming Lake of the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, and then Yanming Lake. It is very relevant. I am very satisfied. I hope that I can think of a good title for the third volume tomorrow. The long and difficult second volume has ended. I am very happy. I feel complete. Thank you. I hope that everyone is happy. Then we will continue to be happy. I will continue to write. However, in September I will accompany my parents on a trip. The manuscript that I mentioned at the beginning of the month has already disappeared. So there will be very few updates. I would like to report this to you in advance. Then please allow me to recommend a book to you. The title is called Inheritance of the Dark Knight. The book number is 2424299. It is an Oriental fantasy story. The reason why I recommend this book is because I know that the author has put a lot of effort into it. Alright, I will not lie. This author is my good friend in life. We often eat, drink, and chat. I know this guy very well. He has a good job, but he is born to write. So, if you are interested, please support him. I will be very grateful. Finally, do you want a monthly ticket? Yes. As I said before, students who do not update well and have requirements in this area do not need to vote for me. For students who have been tormented by me in this area, please do not vote for others. You must vote for me. I want both monthly and recommendation tickets. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. You're tuning in to the Lee May Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.